Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I'll never forget that day in December 2013. I was 12 years old, spending Christmas break at my aunt and uncle's house in Morton, Mississippi. My cousin Joey and I were sitting out on the front porch, enjoying the unseasonably warm weather and chatting about what we hoped to get for Christmas. It was late afternoon, the sun low in the sky casting long shadows across the pasture in front of the house. We were idly watching the cows grazing in the field when suddenly Joey grabbed my arm. "Did you see that?" he whispered urgently. I followed his gaze to the tree line at the far edge of the pasture. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the dark shapes of the trees. But then something moved. My breath caught in my throat as a massive figure emerged from the shadows. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, and it was covered in thick, reddish-brown hair from head to toe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear, maybe? But we didn't have bears around here, and anyway this thing was walking on 2 legs. Joey and I sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe as we watched this creature stride across the pasture. Its gait was smooth but purposeful, covering ground quickly with long, loping steps. When it reached the barbed wire fence at the edge of the property, it simply vaulted over, clearing the 5-foot fence like it was nothing. In a matter of seconds, it had vanished back into the tree line on the other side. Joey and I looked at each other, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "Was that?" Joey whispered. I nodded slowly. "I think we just saw Bigfoot." We sat in stunned silence for a few moments, trying to process what we'd witnessed. Then suddenly we were both talking a mile a minute, comparing notes on what we'd seen. The height, the reddish fur, the way it moved. We were in complete agreement. There was no doubt in either of our minds about what we'd just encountered. Filled with excitement and curiosity, we decided to investigate. We raced across the pasture to where we'd seen the creature cross. Our hearts were pounding as we reached the fence, scanning the ground for any sign of its passage. In our eagerness, we probably trampled all over any tracks or hair it might have left behind. We even tore a few strands of fur off the barbed wire, convinced it must have come from the creature. Looking back now, it was almost certainly just cow hair. When we couldn't find any conclusive evidence, we headed back to the house to tell everyone what we'd seen. We burst through the door, babbling about Bigfoot in the pasture. My aunt and uncle exchanged bemused looks as Joey and I talked over each other, trying to describe every detail. "Slow down," my uncle chuckled. "Now what's all this about?" We took turns explaining what we'd witnessed, growing increasingly frustrated as the adults' expressions shifted from amusement to concern. "Are you two feeling all right?" my aunt asked, pressing a hand to my forehead. "You're not running a fever." "We're fine," I insisted. "We know what we saw." But it quickly became clear that no one believed us. They humored us at first, asking questions that felt more like mockery than genuine interest. Eventually they started suggesting rational explanations. Maybe it was just a deer, or we dozed off and had a vivid shared dream. By the end of the night, our incredible encounter had become a running joke. Any time Joey or I tried to bring it up again, we were met with eye rolls and gentle teasing. "Watch out for Bigfoot," became my uncle's favorite way to say goodbye whenever we left the house. The skepticism and ridicule was upsetting, but it didn't shake our conviction. Joey and I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt what we'd seen that day. We made a pact to stick to our story no matter what. In the days and weeks that followed, we pored over every bit of Bigfoot lore we could find. We scoured the internet for similar sightings in the area, though we never found any. We even tried to go back and search the woods where it had disappeared, but my aunt and uncle wouldn't let us go that far from the house unsupervised. As time passed, we stopped trying to convince the adults. But Joey and I never stopped believing. That brief encounter sparked a lifelong fascination with cryptozoology for both of us. We'd spend hours discussing theories and analyzing supposed evidence of Bigfoot and other mysterious creatures. Now, almost 10 years later, the memory of that day is as vivid as ever. I can still picture every detail of the creature. Its massive frame, the way its muscles rippled beneath that reddish fur as it moved, the ease with which it cleared that fence. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, feeling like I'm right back in that moment of shock and awe. I've tried many times over the years to rationalize what we saw. Could it really have been a bear, a person in a costume, some kind of mass hallucination? But none of those explanations ever felt right. Deep down, I know the truth of what Joey and I witnessed that day. I've never had another experience like it, despite years of hoping and searching. Part of me wishes I could see it again, to prove to myself and everyone else that I wasn't crazy or mistaken, but mostly I'm grateful for that one incredible moment, a glimpse into a world of mystery and wonder that most people never get to see. Sometimes when I visit my aunt and uncle, I find myself staring out at that pasture, half expecting to see that towering figure emerge from the trees again. It never does, of course. But I'll never stop watching and wondering. I know most people reading this probably won't believe me. I'm used to that by now. But I needed to share my story, because I know that somewhere out there, someone else has seen what I saw. Someone else knows the truth. And maybe, just maybe, sharing our experiences will help unlock the mystery of Bigfoot once and for all. Until then, I'll keep searching, keep believing, because I know what I saw that day, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise. Story 2. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been years now. It was supposed to be just a relaxing fishing trip with my buddies Mike and Dave out at Lake Summersville. We'd been planning it for weeks, looking forward to getting away from the daily grind and enjoying some beers by the water. The day started out perfect. Sunny skies, a light breeze, fish biting. We loaded up our small motorboat with our gear and coolers and headed out onto the lake around mid-morning. For the first few hours, everything was great. We caught a few decent-sized bass, cracked open some cold ones, and just enjoyed being out in nature. It was late afternoon when things started to get weird. The sun was getting lower in the sky, and long shadows were stretching across the water. That's when we first heard it. This strange, high-pitched scream coming from the dense forest along the shoreline. At first I thought it might be some kind of bird, or maybe a fox, but it didn't sound quite right. It was too loud, too intense. We all kind of looked at each other uneasily. "What the hell was that?" Dave said. Mike just shrugged, trying to play it cool, but I could tell he was unsettled too. We tried to ignore it and keep fishing, but every few minutes that scream would pierce the air again. It seemed to be moving, circling around the edge of the lake. As it started to get darker, the screaming got more frequent and seemed to be getting closer. That's when we decided it was time to call it a day and head back to shore. I started up the motor, and we began making our way across the lake. But as we got closer to the boat launch, that's when things got really freaky. The screaming suddenly got much louder and more frantic, like whatever was making the sound was in a frenzy. It sounded like it was right at the edge of the trees by the boat launch. We could hear branches snapping and leaves rustling, like something big was thrashing around in there. My heart was pounding as I steered the boat towards the shore. Part of me didn't want to get any closer to whatever was making those sounds, but we had to get the boat out of the water. As we approached the launch, I cut the motor so we could coast in. In the silence, the screaming seemed even more blood-curdling. We were about 20 feet from shore when something came hurtling out of the darkness and splashed into the water right next to the boat. At first I thought it was a branch or something, but then I realized it was a rock. Someone or something had thrown a rock at us. "What the f—" Mike started to say, but he was cut off as another rock flew past his head, barely missing him. We all ducked down as more rocks rained down around us. I frantically tried to restart the motor as Dave and Mike used the oars to push us back out into the lake. That's when I saw it. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I could make out a massive, dark shape emerging from the tree line. It was huge, at least 8 or 9 feet tall, and it was moving, walking, on 2 legs. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. This thing was vaguely human-shaped, but much, much bigger. It had long, powerful arms that hung down almost to its knees, and it was covered in what looked like thick, shaggy fur. As it stepped fully into view, I could see more details that made my blood run cold. Its face was flat and ape-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. But the scariest part was how human it looked. Despite its massive size and bizarre appearance, there was an uncanny intelligence in its eyes and movements. It let out another ear-splitting scream and hurled another rock at us with incredible force. This one struck the side of the boat with a loud crack. I snapped out of my daze and yanked the motor cord, praying it would start. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, the engine roared to life. I gunned it, steering us away from shore as fast as the little boat would go. I heard more splashes behind us as the creature continued to throw rocks, but soon we were out of range. We sped to the opposite side of the lake where our truck was parked. The whole way across, I kept looking back, terrified I'd see that thing swimming after us or something. But there was no sign of it. We beached the boat and scrambled up the bank to where we'd parked. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the ignition. As soon as the truck started, I floored it out of there, not even bothering to properly secure the boat. As we peeled out onto the main road, something huge and dark darted across the pavement about 50 yards ahead of us. It moved incredibly fast, crossing the 2-lane road in just a couple of bounds before disappearing into the woods on the other side. We all saw it. No one said a word. I just kept driving, white-knuckling the steering wheel. It wasn't until we'd gone several miles that anyone spoke. What the hell was that thing?" Dave finally said, his voice shaky. "I don't know, man. I don't know," was all I could say. When we got back to town, we went straight to the sheriff's office to report what happened. The deputy on duty listened to our story with a skeptical look. He jotted down some notes and said they'd send someone out to check the area, but I could tell he didn't really believe us. As we were leaving, an older man who'd been sitting in the waiting area approached us. He introduced himself as Bill and said he'd overheard our story. "I believe you, boys," he said in a low voice. "I've lived in these parts my whole life. There's things in them woods that most folks don't know about, things that ain't natural." He went on to tell us that there had been stories and sightings of some kind of large ape-like creature in the forests around Lake Summersville going back decades. Most people dismissed them as tall tales or mistaken bear sightings, but Bill was convinced there was something out there, something that didn't want to be found. I don't know what to believe anymore. I know what I saw that day, but it doesn't make any sense. How could something like that exist without being documented? Why haven't more people seen it? All I know is I'll never go back to Lake Summersville again. And whenever I'm driving on a dark, lonely road at night, I can't help but scan the tree line, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. I still have nightmares about that day sometimes. The sound of that inhuman scream, the sight of that massive fur-covered shape emerging from the darkness, the feeling of utter helplessness as those rocks rained down around us. I don't know what it was we encountered out there. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species. I have no idea. But I know it was real. And I know it's still out there somewhere, in those deep, dark woods. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers us too, if it's out there right now, waiting for some other unsuspecting people to wander into its territory. The thought keeps me up at night. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just a bear or our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding, and sometimes, if you're unlucky, you might just catch a glimpse of them. But trust me, you'll wish you hadn't. Story 3. I've lived in Kentucky my whole life, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened to my family back in '99. It still gives me chills thinking about it. It all started on a muggy evening in late August. I was helping my mum clean up after dinner when my brother Jason came bursting through the screen door, white as a sheet. He was babbling about seeing something weird by the chicken coop. At first we thought he was just messing around, but the look of terror in his eyes told a different story. I swear to God, there was something out there, he kept saying. It was huge, way bigger than a person, and the way it moved, it wasn't natural. We tried to calm him down, but he was shaking like a leaf. Dad grabbed his shotgun and went to check it out, but didn't find anything unusual. Still, Jason refused to go back outside after dark for days after that. I didn't think much of it at the time. Jason had always been the imaginative type, prone to flights of fancy. But looking back now, I realized that was just the beginning. A few nights later, my other brother Sam was taking out the trash when the motion sensor lights on the back porch suddenly went dark. Now, those lights were brand new. Dad had just installed them the week before. Sam said he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, like he was being watched. He hurried back inside and triple-checked that all the doors were locked that night. We all started getting a little on edge after that. There was this heavy feeling in the air, like the calm before a storm. Even the animals seemed to sense it. The dogs were more skittish than usual, barking at nothing in the middle of the night. The chickens were laying fewer eggs. But it wasn't until what happened to Marcus that we realized we were dealing with something truly unexplainable. Marcus was the oldest of us kids, built like a linebacker. He'd been working construction that summer to save up for college. One Saturday morning in early September, he headed out to the woods behind our property to do some target practice. He liked to set up cans on fallen logs and shoot them with his .22 rifle. Hours went by and he still hadn't come back. Mom was starting to worry when we finally heard the back door slam. Marcus stumbled in, pale and sweating, his clothes torn and muddy. The rifle was nowhere to be seen. We all started talking at once, asking what had happened, but Marcus just collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold the glass of water Mom gave him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You're not going to believe me," he said. "Hell, I don't even believe it myself." He told us he'd been deep in the woods, maybe a mile or so from the house, when he heard something big moving through the underbrush. At first, he thought it was a deer, but then he caught a glimpse of reddish-brown fur through the trees. Whatever it was massive, way bigger than any animal that should have been in those woods. Marcus said he froze, not sure what to do. That's when the thing stepped into a clearing about 50 yards away. He described it as standing close to 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy fur, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. Its face was flat and ape-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the shadows. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then the creature let out a sound that Marcus said was like nothing he'd ever heard before. A cross between a roar and a scream that made his blood run cold. He turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth in blind panic. He said he could hear it behind him, moving impossibly fast for something so large. At one point, he glanced back and saw it reaching for him with huge clawed hands. Somehow he made it back to the house. He couldn't remember dropping the rifle, but his hands were scraped raw from clawing his way through thorny bushes. We all sat in stunned silence as Marcus finished his story. Dad was the first to speak up, saying it must have been a bear. But we all knew bears weren't native to our part of Kentucky. And the way Marcus described it, this was something else entirely. Over the next few weeks, the encounters continued. We'd hear wood-knocking sounds echoing through the trees at night. Eerie howls that were too low and rumbling to be coyotes. Once, Mum swore she saw a pair of red eyes gleaming from the edge of the woods while she was hanging laundry. We started locking all the doors and windows, even in the daytime. None of us went anywhere alone if we could help it. The local sheriff's department wasn't much help. They clearly thought we were either lying or crazy. It all came to a head one night in early October. We were all asleep when a crash from downstairs jolted us awake. At first I thought it was a break-in, but then I heard that bone-chilling roar that Marcus had described. Dad grabbed his gun, and we all huddled in my parents' room, terrified of what might come through that door. The sounds of destruction continued for what felt like hours. Wood splintering, glass shattering, inhuman grunts and growls. And then, as suddenly as it started, everything went quiet. We stayed frozen in place until the first light of dawn started to filter through the windows. When we finally worked up the courage to go downstairs, the scene that greeted us was like something out of a nightmare. The kitchen was absolutely destroyed. The back door had been ripped clean off its hinges. Claw marks gouged deep furrows in the walls and furniture. But strangest of all was the smell, a pungent, musky odor that made my eyes water and my stomach churn. We never saw the creature again after that night, but sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still catch a whiff of that smell on the breeze. And on dark nights, I find myself straining to hear those familiar wood knocks in the distance. I know how it all sounds. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. But I'm telling you, there's something out there in those Kentucky woods, something that science can't explain, and God help you if you ever cross its path. Story 4. I was driving home on that old country road near Hyal, just like any other day. It was late afternoon in the fall of 2015, and the trees were starting to turn those beautiful shades of red and gold. I remember thinking how pretty it all looked as the sun was getting low in the sky. I'd driven that road 1,000 times before, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. Out of nowhere, this massive figure burst out of the tree line and onto the road right in front of my truck. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding out of my chest. Time seemed to slow down as I got a good look at whatever it was. This thing was huge. Had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in reddish-brown hair or fur, matted and wild-looking. The body was massive and muscular, nothing like a bear or any animal I'd ever seen before. But the face, God, that face! It looked almost human, but not quite. The features were exaggerated, with a heavy brow and wide, flaring nostrils. The eyes were dark and intelligent-looking. For a split second, our eyes met, and I swear I saw recognition there, like it knew exactly what I was. The whole thing only lasted a couple seconds. It was carrying something, looked like a big fish, maybe 3 feet long. With just 2 massive strides, it crossed the entire road and disappeared into the woods on the other side. I sat there in shock for a good minute, trying to process what I'd just seen. My hands were shaking as I put the truck back in drive. I sped the rest of the way home, constantly checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that thing following me. When I pulled into the driveway, I ran inside and locked the door behind me. My husband Tom was in the living room and immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. I collapsed onto the couch and told him everything. To his credit, he listened without interrupting, but I could tell he was skeptical. "Are you sure it wasn't just a bear?" he asked gently. I shook my head emphatically. "Tom, I know what I saw. This was no bear. I think it was Bigfoot." The words sounded ridiculous coming out of my mouth, but I knew it was true. Tom seemed concerned but unconvinced. "Honey, there's no such thing as Bigfoot. You've been working long hours. Maybe you're just overtired and your mind was playing tricks on you." I wanted to argue, but honestly, a part of me hoped he was right. The thought of that creature being real and living in our woods was terrifying. We agreed not to tell anyone else about it for now. Who would believe us anyway? As night fell, we tried to go about our normal routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see that hulking figure lurking in the shadows. We were getting ready for bed around 11 p.m. when we heard it, a deep, guttural howl coming from the woods behind our property. It started low and built to a bone-chilling crescendo that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I've heard all kinds of animal noises living out here, but nothing like this. It was almost human, but not quite. Tom and I looked at each other, eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, our dog started going crazy. We have 2 hunting dogs that stay in a kennel out back, and they were barking and howling like I've never heard before. Then we heard the sound of the kennel door banging open and their frantic barks fading as they ran off into the night. Tom grabbed his rifle and flashlight. "Stay here," he said as he headed for the back door. I wanted to stop him, to tell him it wasn't safe, but the words caught in my throat. I watched from the window as the beam of his flashlight swept across the yard and into the tree line. After what felt like an eternity, Tom came back inside. He looked shaken. "The dogs are gone," he said. "Kennel door was ripped clean off its hinges, and there are tracks in the mud. Big ones, bigger than any animal I've ever seen." We barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. The dogs never came back. As soon as the sun came up, we went out to investigate. The kennel was destroyed, just like Tom said, and there in the soft earth were massive footprints, easily 18 inches long. They led from the woods to the kennel, then back into the trees. We followed the tracks as far as we could, but they disappeared once the ground got rockier. We searched for hours, but found no other signs, no hair, no broken branches, nothing. It was like the creature had simply vanished. In the weeks that followed, we heard those unsettling howls a few more times, always late at night and always from deep in the woods. We never saw the creature again, but sometimes at night I swear I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness beyond our yard. We eventually told a few close friends and family members, but most people just laughed it off or assumed we were pulling some kind of prank. The local sheriff's department took a report, but without any real evidence, there wasn't much they could do. It's been years now, and sometimes I wonder if I really saw what I think I saw. But then I remember those eyes, that face that was almost human, but not quite. And I know in my heart that what I encountered that day was real. I still drive that road every day, and every time I pass that spot, I can't help but scan the tree line. Part of me hopes to see it again, to prove to myself and the world that I'm not crazy. But mostly, I pray that whatever it was stays deep in the forest where it belongs. Some things are better left as mysteries, I suppose. But I'll never forget that autumn day when my entire view of the world changed in an instant. I know the truth now. There are things out there in the wild places of the world that defy explanation, and sometimes they cross paths with us, whether we're ready for them or not. Story 5. We drove out to this really remote area along a river, probably a couple hours from Boston. I was excited to do some fishing and spend time outdoors. The spot was beautiful, tall trees all around, the sound of the river rushing by. It felt so peaceful at first. My mom and aunt set up their gear near the car, but I wanted to explore a bit. I grabbed my rod and headed downstream, thinking I might find a good fishing hole. I ended up about 300 yards away from them, just far enough that I could barely see them through the trees. I'd been fishing for maybe 20 minutes when I started to get this weird feeling, like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it, this low, rumbling growl coming from the woods behind me. My heart started racing. I stood completely still, straining my ears. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deep and guttural, almost like a bear, but different somehow, more menacing. I started to pack up my gear, trying to stay calm. That's when I noticed the trees moving. Not just leaves rustling in the wind, but entire saplings bending and snapping. Something big was moving through the forest, circling around me. I abandoned my fishing rod and started walking quickly back towards my mom and aunt. With each step, I heard heavy footfalls behind me, matching my pace. Twigs snapped and branches cracked. Whatever it was following me. I wanted to run, but I was terrified that if I did, it would chase me. So I kept walking as fast as I could without breaking into a sprint. My legs were shaking so bad I could barely put one foot in front of the other. The whole time, I kept hearing those heavy footsteps and that awful growling noise. Sometimes it sounded like it was right behind me, other times off to the side. But I never caught a glimpse of what was making the sounds. It was like it was invisible. As I got closer to where my mom and aunt were, the noises started to fade. By the time I reached them, everything was quiet again. I was in a cold sweat, my heart pounding out of my chest. I tried to tell them what happened, but I was so shaken up I could barely get the words out. When I finally managed to explain, they just laughed it off. My aunt said there were old stories about Bigfoot in those woods, but it was probably just a deer or something. I knew it wasn't a deer. Whatever I heard was massive, and the sounds it made, I'll never forget them as long as I live. But I could tell they didn't believe me, so I dropped it. We fished for a couple more hours, but I stayed right by them the whole time. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see some huge, hairy creature emerge from the trees. But nothing happened. On the drive home, I was quiet, replaying everything in my mind. Had I imagined it all? But no, the fear I felt was too real. The sounds, the footsteps, the trees moving. It all happened. For weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about being chased through those woods. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, that growling echoing in my ears. I begged my parents not to make me go camping or fishing again that summer. To this day, I've never been able to explain what happened. I've read about other Bigfoot encounters since then, and some of the details are eerily similar to what I experienced. The feeling of being watched, the guttural noises, something massive moving through the trees without being seen. I don't know if it was actually Bigfoot or some other creature. All I know is that something was out there in those woods, something that defied explanation. And for those terrifying minutes, it was stalking me. I'm 28 now, and I've never gone back to those woods. Just thinking about it still gives me chills. Sometimes when I'm alone in nature, I'll hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, and for a split second I'm 13 again, paralyzed with fear as something inhuman lurks just out of sight. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. Maybe it was some kind of large animal that I misinterpreted. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real. There are things out there in the wilderness that we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of the natural world. That day changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are mysteries in this world that science hasn't unraveled yet. I became fascinated with cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. I've read countless books and articles, watched every documentary I could find. But no matter how much I learn, I can't shake the visceral memory of that day. The primal fear, the certainty that I was being hunted by something not quite human. It's a feeling I wouldn't wish on anyone. I still love nature and the outdoors. I go hiking and camping with friends, but I'm always hyper-aware of my surroundings now. Every unexplained sound makes me tense up. I'm constantly scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a massive, hair-covered form watching me. I've never told this story publicly before. For years, I was afraid people would think I was crazy or making it up for attention, but I know what I experienced was real, and I wonder how many others have had similar encounters but were too afraid to speak up. If you're reading this and you've had a similar experience, know that you're not alone. There are things out there that we can't explain. I don't know if it was Bigfoot that day in the Massachusetts woods, but I know it was something beyond our normal understanding of wildlife. To this day, I can close my eyes and be right back there. The sound of the river, the smell of the forest, and that bone-chilling growl echoing through the trees. It's a memory that will stay with me forever, a reminder that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than we often realize. I still have so many unanswered questions. What exactly was out there that day? Why did it seem to be stalking me? And why did it disappear so suddenly when I got close to my family? I may never know the answers, but I do know that my experience was real, and it forever changed the way I view the world around me. Story 6. It was a crisp morning in early June when I set out on what I thought would be a routine survey in the Lamar Valley. The valley was lush and green, dotted with herds of bison and elk, grazing peacefully. I had my usual gear, binoculars, radio collar receiver, notebook, and first aid kit. Little did I know how crucial that first aid kit would become. As I hiked deeper into a more remote section of the valley, I picked up a faint radio signal from one of our collared wolves. I decided to follow it, hoping to get some valuable data on the pack's movements. The signal led me off the main trail and into a densely forested area I hadn't explored before. The forest was eerily quiet, no bird calls or rustling of small animals. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach, but I pressed on. Suddenly, I heard a low, guttural moan coming from up ahead. My first thought was that it might be an injured animal, possibly one of our wolves. I quickened my pace, pushing through the undergrowth. What I saw when I reached a small clearing nearly stopped my heart. There, caught in an old rusty bear trap, was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen before. At first glance, it appeared to be a large, hair-covered humanoid figure. Its body was covered in reddish-brown fur, matted with blood around its leg, where the trap had clamped down. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature's head snapped up, and our eyes met. In that moment, I felt a jolt of recognition. Its eyes were startlingly human-like, filled with pain and fear. It let out another moan, softer this time, almost pleading. My training kicked in, overriding my shock and fear. Whatever this creature was, it was in pain and needed help. I approached slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice, like I would with an injured wolf. The creature watched me warily, but didn't make any aggressive moves. As I got closer, I could see the extent of the damage. The old trap had dug deep into the creature's lower leg, creating a nasty gash. I knew I had to remove the trap and treat the wound quickly to prevent infection. But first, I needed to sedate the creature for both our safety. With shaking hands, I prepared a dose of tranquilizer from my kit. The creature seemed to sense what I was doing and actually held still as I administered the injection. Within minutes, its eyes began to droop and its body relaxed. Once it was fully sedated, I got to work on the trap. It was an old model, thankfully not as vicious as some of the newer ones, but it still took all my strength to pry it open. As soon as the pressure was released, blood began flowing freely from the wound. I quickly applied pressure and began cleaning the area with antiseptic wipes from my kit. As I worked, I couldn't help but study the creature more closely. Its body structure was remarkably human-like, with opposable thumbs and facial features that were shockingly familiar. Yet it was covered in thick fur, had slightly elongated arms, and powerful-looking legs. I estimated it to be about 7 feet tall when standing. I applied a generous amount of iodine to the wound and wrapped it tightly with gauze. Throughout the process, my mind was reeling. Was this the legendary Bigfoot? How was this possible? Everything I knew about biology and evolution was being challenged by this creature's very existence. Just as I finished bandaging the leg, the creature began to stir. The sedative was wearing off faster than I'd anticipated. Panic gripped me as I realized the danger of my situation. I quickly packed up my supplies and began backing away. The creature's eyes fluttered open, focusing on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. It slowly sat up, examining its treated leg with what looked like curiosity. Then it turned its gaze back to me. I held my breath, unsure of what would happen next. To my utter amazement, the creature raised its hand in what appeared to be a gesture of gratitude. It nodded its head slightly. Then, in a movement far too graceful for its size, it stood and limped towards the dense forest. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the undergrowth, leaving me standing there in disbelief. I don't know how long I stood there trying to process what had just happened. When I finally gathered my wits, I realized I had no photographic evidence, no physical proof of what I'd seen. Who would believe me? The trek back to my vehicle was a blur. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. By the time I reached the ranger station, I was convinced I must have imagined it all. But the blood on my hands and the depleted supplies in my first aid kit told a different story. I took a leave of absence from work, claiming I was dealing with personal issues. In reality, I was grappling with the implications of what I'd seen. How could a creature like that exist without being definitively documented? What did it mean for our understanding of human evolution? For months, I debated whether to share my experience with anyone. The fear of ridicule and potentially ruining my professional reputation kept me silent. But the memory of those human-like eyes haunted me. I knew what I had seen was real. It wasn't until I returned to work that I found the courage to confide in a colleague, Dr. Elena Reeves. To my shock, Elena didn't immediately dismiss my story. Instead, she went pale and admitted that she had seen a similar creature in the same area just a few weeks after my encounter. Elena's corroboration gave me the validation I needed. We've since formed a small, secretive research group dedicated to finding evidence of these creatures. We haven't had any more direct encounters, but we've found some intriguing tracks and hair samples that don't match any known species. I still struggle with what I experienced that day. It challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world and my place in it. But it also filled me with a sense of wonder and humility. There are still mysteries out there, things beyond our current understanding. And I was lucky enough, or perhaps unlucky enough, to come face to face with one of them. As I write this, I can still see those eyes looking at me, intelligent, afraid, and so achingly familiar. Whatever that creature was, it was more than just an animal. It was a thinking, feeling being, and helping it that day was both the most terrifying and most profound experience of my life. I don't know if I'll ever encounter that creature again, or if we'll ever be able to prove its existence to the world, but I do know that my experience in Yellowstone changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there's so much more to this world than we realize, and it left me with a burning question that I fear may never be answered. What other incredible secrets is nature still hiding from us? Story 7. I was 12 years old at the time, staying up way past my bedtime watching TV in the living room while my parents slept. The house was dark except for the flickering blue glow of the television. Outside, the cicadas and frogs were making their usual racket. Around midnight, I heard our old hound dog Rusty start barking like crazy out in the yard. At first I ignored it. That mutt was always carrying on about something or other. But then the barking changed to a high-pitched yelp, like he was hurt or scared. I got up and peered out the window, trying to see what was going on. The moonlight cast weird shadows across the overgrown yard. I could just make out Rusty's shape near the edge of the woods, hackles raised as he barked at something in the darkness. That's when I saw it. A massive dark figure, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, emerged from the tree line. My blood ran cold. It was vaguely man-shaped, but covered in thick, matted fur. As it moved into the yard, I could see its arms were impossibly long, hanging down past its knees. I was frozen in terror, unable to look away or call for help. The creature loped across the yard on 2 legs, but in a weird, unnatural gait. Its head swiveled towards the house, and for a split second, I swear, its eyes locked with mine. They glowed an eerie yellowish green in the darkness. Rusty lunged at the thing, still barking frantically. Without breaking stride, it backhanded the dog, sending him flying with a pained yelp. Then it was at the house, so fast I could hardly believe it. A huge, hairy arm reached for the doorknob. I heard the wood creak and groan as it yanked on the door. Thank God we always kept it locked at night. Heart pounding, I finally managed to find my voice and screamed for my parents. The creature's head snapped towards me. I'll never forget that face, if you could call it a face. It was like a twisted mashup of an ape and a wolf, with a flat, pushed-in nose and a mouth full of sharp teeth. Just then, headlights swept across the yard as a car turned into our long driveway. The thing's head whipped around towards the light. In one fluid motion, it bounded across the porch and cleared our 6-foot fence like it was nothing. By the time my parents came running out of their room, the creature had vanished into the woods. Of course, they didn't believe me at first. But then we found deep claw marks gouged into the front door and Rusty nursing a nasty wound on his side. The next day, word spread quickly through our little community. Turns out, we weren't the only ones who'd had a frightening encounter that night. Our nearest neighbors, the Johnsons, lived about a half-mile down the road. Jack Johnson had been coming home late from his shift at the paper mill when he saw something huge and hairy crouched on his front porch. He said when his headlights hit it, the thing leapt clear over their fence in one bound. His wife Mary was home alone at the time. She told my mum she'd heard something rattling the doorknob and scratching at the door. When she went to check, thinking it was Jack home from work, she saw a massive fur-covered arm reaching around the door frame. She screamed and slammed the door shut, then hid in the bedroom until Jack got home. Old man Wilson, who lived on the other side of us, swore up and down that something had gotten into his rabbit hutches that night. He found several cages torn open, rabbits missing. There were weird tracks in the mud nearby, huge barefoot prints, but shaped all wrong for a human. For weeks afterward, folks in the area were on edge. Some started calling it the swamp monster. There were more sightings over the next few days. Shadowy figures darting across roads at night, eerie howls echoing from the swamps, livestock going missing. My parents tried to convince me I'd just had a nightmare, that my imagination was running wild. But I know what I saw. That thing was real, and it was like nothing that should exist in this world. The creature itself never returned to our property after that night. But sometimes, when I'm back home visiting my folks, I'll be out in the yard at dusk and get the distinct feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I hurry inside before full dark falls. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that summer. Maybe it was some kind of mutated bear or an escaped gorilla. Hell, maybe the summer heat and isolation out there in the boonies drove us all a little crazy. But deep down, I know the truth. There's something out there in those swamps, something that ain't natural, and God help anyone who runs into it alone in the dark. I never told many people about what I saw. Who'd believe a kid's wild story about a monster, right? But it's stuck with me all these years. Sometimes I still have nightmares about glowing eyes in the darkness and massive hairy arms reaching for me. I moved away from Louisiana years ago, went off to college, and built a life for myself far from those swamps. But a part of me has always wondered, is that thing still out there? Has anyone else seen it over the years? I've done some digging over the years, poring over old newspaper archives and internet forums. Turns out there's been stories of strange creatures in that area going back generations, Native American legends of the rougarou, French settlers' tales of the loup-garou. Most folks write it off as backwoods superstition, but sometimes I wonder if there's more to it. Maybe there's some kind of unknown primate species out there, lurking in the most remote swamps and forests. Or maybe it's something we don't have a name for yet. I know how crazy it all sounds. Believe me, there's times I've wondered if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the fear in my neighbors' eyes as they recounted their experiences. The claw marks on our door. The way Rusty was never quite the same after that night, always on edge and growling at shadows. These days, I try not to dwell on it too much. But every now and then, when I'm falling asleep at night, I'll jerk awake with the vivid memory of yellow eyes gleaming in the dark. And for a split second, I'm that terrified 12-year-old kid again, coming face to face with something that shouldn't exist. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that summer. Part of me doesn't want to know. But I do know this. There are things out there in this world that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our civilization and technology, nature still holds secrets we can't begin to fathom. So, if you ever find yourself out in the swamps of Louisiana on a hot summer night, and you hear something moving in the darkness that sounds bigger than it ought to be, don't stick around to investigate. You might not like what you find. As for me, I'll keep telling my story. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar. Maybe someday we'll get some answers. But until then, I'll keep one eye on the woods after dark, because you never know what might be looking back. Story 8. It was a warm July afternoon in 2002, and I decided to take my boat out for some fishing. I live in northern Wisconsin, surrounded by dense forests and pristine lakes. Fishing has always been my escape, a way to clear my head and enjoy the serenity of nature. Little did I know that this particular trip would change my life forever. I headed out to my favorite spot on the lake, a secluded area near some lily pads where the fish always seemed to bite. The air was thick with humidity, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the boat and the occasional call of a loon in the distance. I cast my line and settled in, enjoying the peace and quiet. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the water, I heard something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a strange, guttural noise coming from the shoreline, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. At first, I tried to dismiss it as some kind of animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but deep down, I knew this was something different. The noise grew louder, and I could hear branches snapping and undergrowth being trampled. My heart started racing as I realized whatever was making that sound was getting closer. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the tree line, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold them steady. That's when I saw them. Emerging from the dense thicket were 4 or 5 creatures. I hesitate to call them animals because they looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. They were massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in thick, reddish-brown fur. Their bodies resembled orangutans, but their faces, God, their faces were almost human-like. It was the most unsettling thing I've ever seen. I froze, unable to process what I was witnessing. These things shouldn't exist, not here in Wisconsin, not anywhere. As I watched in horror, one of the creatures, a cinnamon-colored one, started moving towards the water's edge. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I swear, in that moment, I felt like I was staring into the abyss. Those eyes were dark, almost black, and they seemed wrong. Possessed, even. Panic set in, and I knew I had to get out of there. I fumbled with the boat's motor, my hands slick with sweat. The creature was getting closer, moving with an unnatural speed for something so large. As I finally got the engine started, I heard a splash. To my horror, the thing was in the water, swimming towards my boat with powerful strokes. I gunned the engine, desperate to put as much distance between myself and these monsters as possible. In my panic, I didn't notice how close the creature had gotten. As I swerved away, I felt a sickening thud and heard an inhuman howl of pain. The boat's propeller had struck the creature. Looking back, I saw a cloud of blood in the water where the thing had been. The other creatures were rushing to the shore, making those awful guttural sounds. To my shock, they started helping their injured companion, pulling it from the water with what looked like genuine concern. It was a display of compassion I never expected to see from such terrifying beings. I sped back to the dock, my mind reeling from what I'd just experienced. As soon as I got home, I collapsed into my wife Lisa's arms, babbling incoherently about what I'd seen. She could tell something was seriously wrong. I'm not the type to get spooked easily. As I recounted my story, Lisa's face grew pale. She reminded me of the strange noises we'd been hearing across the lake for the past few months, sounds we'd written off as coyotes or other wildlife. Now, those memories took on a much more sinister meaning. We decided to contact the local animal control, thinking they might be able to shed some light on what I'd seen. When I mentioned the blood in the water from where I'd struck the creature, they seemed interested and asked if they could take a sample from my boat's propeller. A few days later, we got a call back. They claimed the blood was just from a deer, probably one that had been swimming across the lake and got too close to my boat. But something about their explanation felt off. It was too dismissive, too quick. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were covering something up. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't bring myself to go back out on the lake. Every time I looked at the water, I half expected to see those creatures emerging from the trees. Lisa and I started hearing those strange noises more frequently, always from the same area where I'd had my encounter. We've tried to move on with our lives, but the memory of that day haunts me. I've done research, looked into Bigfoot sightings and other cryptid encounters, but nothing quite matches what I saw. Those weren't just animals. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a sense of awareness that chills me to this day. I don't know what those creatures were or if they're still out there. Part of me hopes I imagined the whole thing, that it was some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. And sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear those guttural noises echoing across the lake, a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. I've never shared this story publicly before. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw that day, and I'll carry that knowledge with me for the rest of my life. If you're ever in the woods of northern Wisconsin, keep your eyes open and your ears alert. You never know what might be watching you from the shadows. Story 9. It was a beautiful summer morning as we set off into the dense forest. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine needles. Birds were chirping overhead, and sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. My sister and I felt like real adventurers as we climbed over fallen logs and pushed through thick ferns. After a couple hours of hiking, we stumbled upon a hidden lake we'd never seen before. The water was incredibly clear and still, reflecting the surrounding trees like a mirror. We were hot and tired from our trek, so we decided to rest for a bit on a grassy slope overlooking the lake. The gentle lapping of the water against the shore was so soothing that we must have dozed off. I'm not sure how long we were asleep, but I was suddenly jolted awake by strange noises coming from the direction of the lake. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The sounds were unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was a mixture of low grunts, whooping calls, and what sounded like laughter, but not quite human. I nudged my sister awake, and we peered over the crest of the hill toward the lake shore. What we saw made my blood run cold. There, gathered around the edge of the water, was a group of enormous, hairy creatures. I counted 14 adults and at least a dozen smaller ones, including 2 tiny infants cradled in the arms of larger figures. They were undeniably Bigfoot, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy brown and black fur. But they weren't behaving like the scary monsters from campfire stories. They were having a picnic. The adult creatures were wading in the shallows, splashing each other and making those strange whooping sounds. The younger ones chased each other along the shore, play-fighting and tumbling in the grass. My sister and I were frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe. Part of me wanted to run screaming, but a bigger part was utterly fascinated by the scene before us. These creatures, which I'd always believed were just legends, were acting so human. They clearly had family units and social structures. I watched as one of the smaller Bigfoots fell and scraped its knee. An adult immediately came over to comfort it, patting its head and examining the injury. We must have watched them for close to an hour, though it felt like both an eternity and an instant. Eventually, one of the adults let out a different kind of call, almost like it was signaling the others. The group began to gather up what looked like crude baskets or pouches. The younger ones bounded over to the adults, and they started to move away from the lake as a group. Just as I thought they were about to disappear into the trees, one of the creatures, a massive male with silver-streaked fur, turned and looked directly at our hiding spot. I swear our eyes met for a split second. A jolt of fear shot through me. Had he known we were there the whole time? That was enough to break the spell. My sister and I scrambled to our feet and took off running back the way we'd come. We crashed through the underbrush in a panic, convinced at any moment we'd hear the thunder of giant footsteps behind us. But nothing pursued us. We burst into our campsite, out of breath and wild-eyed. Our parents were relaxing by the fire and jumped up in alarm when they saw us. We babbled out our story, talking over each other in our excitement and fear. Mum and Dad exchanged worried looks. They clearly didn't believe us, assuming we'd let our imaginations run wild or eaten some questionable berries in the woods. But something in our demeanor must have unsettled them. Dad insisted on hiking out to the lake to check things out, just to put our minds at ease. He took his hunting rifle, which he never carried on casual hikes. Mom made us stay behind at the campsite with her. Dad was gone for several hours. When he finally returned, his face was pale and he was visibly shaken. He wouldn't tell us exactly what he'd seen, but he immediately started packing up our gear. We left the campground that very night, cutting our trip short by several days. It wasn't until years later that my father finally told me what happened on his hike that day. He'd found the lake easily enough. Apparently it wasn't as hidden as we'd thought. At first he saw nothing unusual, but as he was about to head back, he heard movement in the trees behind him. When he turned, he came face to face with an enormous, fur-covered creature. It regarded him silently for a moment, then melted back into the forest without a sound. Dad said he'd never run so fast in his life. He was convinced that if the creature had wanted to harm him, it easily could have. Instead, it seemed to be sending him a message. This was its territory, and we weren't welcome. We never went camping in that area again. In fact, my parents put our house on the market within a month, and we moved to a different part of the state. They claimed it was for Dad's job, but I always suspected it had more to do with what happened that summer. To this day, I'm not sure how to reconcile what we saw. It goes against everything science tells us is possible. But I know what I witnessed. A thriving community of creatures that aren't supposed to exist, living peacefully in a hidden corner of the world. Sometimes I wonder if they're still there, having their lakeside picnics and raising their young, just out of sight of the human world. I've never told this story publicly before. For years I convinced myself it must have been some kind of shared delusion or dream. But the older I get, the more certain I become of what we encountered that day. There are things in this world that defy explanation, living just beyond the edges of our understanding. And sometimes, if we're very lucky or very unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them. I still have nightmares sometimes about that silver-backed male turning to look at me. In my dreams, instead of running away, I stay and watch as the creatures approach. They gather around me, their musky scent filling my nostrils, their dark eyes filled with an ancient wisdom. They reach out to touch me with massive, gentle hands. And just as I'm about to learn their secrets, I always wake up. Part of me wishes I could go back to that lake, to see if they're still there. But a bigger part knows it's better left as a mystery. Some things aren't meant for us to fully understand. All I know is that my encounter with the Bigfoot family changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than we can imagine. And for that, I'll always be grateful. Story 10. I remember that day in October 1989 like it was yesterday. The crisp autumn air, the smell of hay and manure, the sound of the cows lowing in the pasture. It was just a normal day on my dairy farm in Walworth County. I was 33 years old at the time, still relatively new to running the farm on my own after taking it over from my father a few years prior. I woke up before dawn as usual and went about my morning chores, milking the cows, feeding the animals, checking the fences. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. It wasn't until late afternoon that things took a turn for the bizarre. I was out in the back pasture, doing a final check on the herd before bringing them in for the evening milking. The sun was starting to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. As I made my way along the fence line, I had this odd prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. At first I tried to shake it off. Living in rural Wisconsin, you get used to all sorts of wildlife watching you from the woods, but this felt different somehow, more intense. I found myself scanning the tree line, searching for whatever was causing that uneasy feeling. That's when I saw it. Just for a split second, a flash of movement near the old stone pile at the edge of the pasture. I froze, straining my eyes to get a better look. For a moment, everything was still. Then I saw it again, a large grey shape darting between the rocks. My heart started racing. This was no ordinary animal. It was bigger than any dog I'd ever seen, almost the size of a small bear. But the way it moved was all wrong for a bear. It was quicker, more agile. As I watched, it poked its head up from behind the rocks, and I got my first clear look at the creature. Its face was vaguely canine, with a long snout and pointed ears, but the eyes... God, the eyes were like nothing I'd ever seen on an animal. They were large and intelligent-looking, almost human-like in their intensity. For a brief moment, our gazes locked, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The creature's fur was a silvery grey color that seemed to shimmer in the fading sunlight. Its body was lean and muscular, with long limbs that looked built for speed. And the tail, it was long and bushy, almost fox-like. I stood there paralyzed for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't fit with any animal I knew of in these parts. Suddenly, the spell was broken as one of the cows let out a loud bellow. The creature's ears pricked up and its head swiveled towards the sound. That's when my instincts finally kicked in and I started moving towards it, wanting to get a closer look and maybe chase it off my land. But as soon as I took a step, the thing vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it had ducked behind the rocks and disappeared. I ran over to the stone pile, my heart pounding in my ears. But when I got there, the creature was nowhere to be seen. I searched all around the area, looking for any sign of where it could have gone. That's when I noticed the tracks in the soft dirt near the base of the rock pile. They were huge, easily twice the size of a large dog's paw prints. The shape was similar to a canine print, but distorted somehow, elongated and with strange claw marks. I followed the tracks, but they only went for about 20 feet before suddenly vanishing in the middle of the pasture. It was like the creature had simply evaporated into thin air. By this point, the sun had almost set, and darkness was falling fast. I hurried to round up the cows and get them into the barn, constantly looking over my shoulder. That night, I barely slept a wink. Every little sound had me sitting bolt upright in bed, wondering if that thing was prowling around outside. The next morning, I went back out to the pasture at first light to investigate further. But the tracks from the night before had been mostly obliterated by the cows moving through the area. All that was left were a few indistinct depressions in the dirt. I spent the next few weeks on high alert, watching for any sign of the creature returning. But I never saw it again. To this day, I have no explanation for what I encountered that October evening. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to convince myself it was just a wolf or a coyote. But I know what I saw. That thing was like no animal I've ever seen before or since. The size, the strange coloring, those eerie, human-like eyes. It just doesn't add up to anything normal. I've heard stories over the years of other folks in the area seeing strange creatures, talk of Bigfoot sightings up in the North Woods, or livestock being killed by some unknown predator. I always took those tales with a grain of salt, but after what I saw that day, I'm not so quick to dismiss them anymore. Sometimes on quiet nights, when I'm out in the pasture doing a final check on the herd, I'll get that prickly feeling on the back of my neck again, like something's watching me from just beyond the tree line. I'll scan the shadows, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. But so far, it's never reappeared. I don't know what that creature was or where it came from. Maybe it was some kind of undiscovered species. Maybe it was something not of this world. All I know is that it shook me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I've never told many people about what happened that day. Folks around here aren't too keen on tall tales, and I didn't want to get a reputation as the crazy farmer who sees monsters. But it's weighed on me all these years. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember those eyes, that silvery fur, those massive paw prints, and I know it was real. I still run the dairy farm to this day. My kids help out now, and someday they'll take it over just like I did from my father. But I've never told them about what I saw. How do you even begin to explain something like that? So I keep it to myself, always watching, always wondering if someday that mysterious creature will return. Every time I pass by that old stone pile, I can't help but pause for a moment. My eyes are drawn to the shadows between the rocks, searching for any hint of movement. So far it's always been empty, but deep down I know that thing is still out there somewhere. And a part of me hopes that someday, somehow, I'll get the chance to see it again and finally unravel the mystery of what I encountered on that autumn evening so many years ago. Story 11. I'll never forget that day in Julian back in 2007. It started out like any other morning on my secluded mountain property, but little did I know it would be the last time I'd ever feel safe there again. I'd moved to Julian about a year earlier, seeking a quiet place to write and get away from the bustle of city life. My little cabin sat on 5 acres of dense forest, far from any neighbors. At first, I loved the solitude and natural beauty. But over the past few weeks, things had started to feel off. It began with the smell. One day, this bizarre odor appeared out of nowhere. I can't even describe it. Kind of musky and rotten, but also weirdly sweet. It would come and go at random, sometimes so strong it made me gag. I checked for dead animals, looked for leaks or mold, even had a plumber come check the septic system. Nothing. The smell had no obvious source. Then the animal skulls started showing up. I'd find them in the oddest places, perched on my porch railing, hanging from tree branches, lined up along the edge of my driveway. Mostly smaller animals like rabbits and squirrels, but occasionally larger skulls I couldn't identify. At first I assumed it was just the local wildlife, but the careful arrangement seemed deliberate. It creeped me out, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some neighbor kids were playing pranks. That morning I woke up early and decided to take my coffee out to the back porch to watch the sunrise. As I stepped outside, that damn smell hit me like a wall. My eyes started watering, it was so strong. I was about to go back inside when movement caught my eye at the tree line about 50 yards away. At first I thought it was a bear. We got those sometimes, and the broad shoulders and bulky body seemed right. But as I squinted to see better in the dim light, I realized something was very wrong with its proportions. Its head was bizarrely elongated, almost cone-shaped, and it wasn't on all fours like a bear. It was sitting back on its haunches in a weirdly human-like position. I froze, coffee mug halfway to my mouth, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature hadn't seemed to notice me yet. It was licking itself, like a dog grooming its fur. But the movements were all wrong, jerky and awkward. A twig snapped under my foot, and its head snapped up to look directly at me. I felt my blood turn to ice, its face. God, I still see it in my nightmares. Vaguely ape-like, but with sunken, glowing eyes and a mouth full of far too many teeth. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then it stood up. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, ending in huge hands with wickedly curved claws. Dark, matted fur covered its body. It took a single step towards me and let out a low, rumbling growl that I felt in my bones. I don't even remember running back inside. 1 second I was on the porch. The next I was huddled in my bedroom closet, shaking uncontrollably. I stayed there for hours, straining to hear any sound of the creature trying to get in. But there was nothing, just oppressive silence. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, the thing was gone. But that horrific smell lingered, stronger than ever. I threw some clothes in a bag and got the hell out of there, driving straight to my sister's place in San Diego. I was hyperventilating the whole way, constantly checking my rearview mirror. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it, that lack of sleep and isolation had made me hallucinate. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, but this was something different, something much worse. It took me weeks to stop jumping at every sound and shadow. I couldn't sleep without nightmares. Eventually, I hired some guys to go clear out my belongings from the cabin. They reported nothing unusual, but the smell was still there. I sold the property as is and took a major loss just to be rid of it. It's been years now, but I still can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something truly horrific that day. Sometimes I wonder if that thing is still out there in those woods, waiting. I've never gone back to Julian, and I never will. Some things are better left alone in the dark. I know this all sounds crazy. Hell, most days I can barely believe it myself. But I swear on everything I hold dear, it happened exactly as I've described. I don't know what that creature was or where it came from. I just know that encountering it fundamentally changed me. I no longer feel safe in the wilderness. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for that smell to hit me again. I've tried to research similar encounters, but nothing quite matches what I experienced. The closest I've found are some obscure folklore about skinwalkers or wendigos, but even those don't quite fit. This was something older, more primordial, like it didn't quite belong in our reality. The worst part is the not knowing. Did anyone else ever see it? Is it still out there? Sometimes I wonder if I should have reported it to someone, but who would believe me? And what if drawing attention to it only made things worse? All I know is that I'll never forget that morning in Julian. The oppressive silence of the forest, the putrid, cloying smell, and those glowing eyes, filled with an intelligence that was unmistakably alien, yet terrifyingly aware. It was looking at me not as prey, but as an equal, another thinking, feeling being. And somehow that was even more horrifying. I still have nightmares where I'm back on that porch, paralyzed as the creature lumbers towards me. I always wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom scent of rot and musk in my nostrils. On the worst nights, I swear I can hear that bone-chilling growl echoing in the distance. I don't know why I'm sharing this now. Maybe writing it all out will help me process it somehow. Or maybe I'm hoping that someone out there has had a similar experience and can help me make sense of it all. All I know is that encounter changed me forever. I no longer see the world as I once did. There are things out there beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows at the edges of our reality. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we stumble upon them. I just count myself lucky that I made it out alive. Others may not be so fortunate. So please, be careful out there in the wilderness. You never know what might be watching from just beyond the trees. I still struggle with anxiety and hypervigilance, especially in wooded areas. Therapy has helped some, but there's always that nagging fear in the back of my mind. Will I ever encounter something like that again? Part of me hopes I do, just to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But a bigger part hopes I never have to face anything like that for the rest of my life. I've tried to move on, to put it all behind me. But some experiences change you on a fundamental level. They reshape your understanding of reality and leave you forever altered. That's what happened to me that day in Julian. And no matter how much time passes, I don't think I'll ever be the same person I was before I saw that thing in the woods. Story 12. The morning started off normal enough. I hiked a few miles in, set up in a good spot, and waited. Around 9 a.m. I finally got my chance. A nice 8-point buck wandered into range. I took the shot and hit it clean. The deer ran about 50 yards before going down. I was pumped. It was a great start to the season. I waited about 30 minutes before going to retrieve it, like you're supposed to. As I approached where the deer had fallen, that's when things got weird. I heard rustling in the brush ahead of me. At first I figured it was just the dying deer thrashing around, but then I heard heavy footsteps and breaking branches. My first thought was, oh shit, a grizzly got to my deer. I nocked an arrow, ready to scare off whatever it was. But when I got closer, I realized this was way bigger than a grizzly. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of reddish-brown fur. Then I saw it stand up on 2 legs. Holy shit, it had to be 9 feet tall at least. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It turned and looked right at me with these intense eyes. I felt like it was staring into my soul. That's when it hit me. This thing was a Bigfoot, an actual fucking Bigfoot. I'd always thought they were just legends, but there was no mistaking what I was looking at. Its body was massive and muscular, way bigger than any bear. The arms were crazy long, hanging down past its knees. The face was a mix of ape and human features. But those eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. They were too intelligent, too aware. This was no animal. I was frozen in shock, just staring at it. Then it made this ungodly sound, like a roar mixed with a scream. It was so loud, it felt like it rattled my bones. That snapped me out of it, and pure terror took over. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I could hear it crashing through the forest behind me. The sounds it made, Jesus, I get chills thinking about it. It was roaring and howling, breaking branches like they were twigs. I knew if it caught me, I was dead. I ran for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20-30 minutes. My lungs were on fire, and my legs felt like jelly, but terror kept me going. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I broke out of the tree line onto an old logging road. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. After a few minutes, I realized the sounds had stopped. I looked back towards the forest but saw nothing. It was dead quiet except for my ragged breathing. I got up on shaky legs and started hobbling down the road, praying I'd run into someone. About a mile later, I flagged down a truck. The old guy driving must have thought I was insane. I was babbling about Bigfoot and couldn't stop shaking. He probably assumed I was on drugs or something, but he was kind enough to give me a ride back to my truck. When I got back to where I'd parked, I noticed my bow was missing from the back. That's when it hit me. All my gear was still out there where I'd shot the deer. Fuck that, there was no way I was going back for it. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I drove straight home in a daze. My wife freaked out when she saw the state I was in. I tried to explain what happened, but I could tell she didn't believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself. But I knew what I saw. It took me weeks to work up the courage to go back for my gear. When I finally did, with 2 buddies for backup, everything was gone. No sign of the deer carcass, no scraps of my pack or camera. Nothing. It was like it never happened. That encounter changed me. I haven't been able to hunt alone since then. Just the thought of being out in the woods by myself makes me break out in a cold sweat. I've tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just a bear or my mind playing tricks. But deep down I know the truth. There's something out there in those mountains, something that defies explanation. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I know what I saw. And I pray to God I never see it again. I still have nightmares about those eyes. That sound. Sometimes I wake up in a panic, feeling like I'm being watched. My wife says I need therapy, and maybe she's right. But how do you explain something like this to a shrink without sounding certifiable? I've done some research since then, looking into other Bigfoot sightings in the area. Turns out there have been quite a few over the years. Some of the details match up with what I saw: the reddish fur, the incredible size and strength. It makes me wonder how many other encounters have gone unreported because people were too afraid of ridicule. The worst part is the not knowing. Was it really Bigfoot? If so, how have they remained hidden for so long? Are there more of them out there? And why did it take my deer but not attack me? These questions haunt me. I've thought about reporting it to the authorities or some cryptozoology group, but I always chicken out. I'm afraid of being labeled as the crazy Bigfoot guy. My reputation, my job, my family, I can't risk all that, so I keep it to myself, only sharing anonymously like this. Sometimes I wonder if I should go back out there with cameras, try to get proof. But then I remember the pure terror of that day and I know I could never do it. The thought of coming face to face with that thing again. It's too much. I still go hunting, but never alone and never in that area. I stick to more populated spots now, places where I know there will be other people around. It's not the same, but it's better than giving up the sport entirely. My kids keep asking when I'm going to take them out hunting. I've been putting it off, making excuses. The truth is, I'm terrified of exposing them to whatever's out there. How can I protect them from something I can't even explain? I've become hyper-aware of every sound in the woods now. Every snapped twig or rustling bush sets my heart racing. I find myself constantly scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me. There are times when I almost convince myself it was all a dream or hallucination. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something on the news, another mysterious sighting, an unexplained sound recorded in the wilderness, and it all comes flooding back. I know this sounds crazy. Hell, if someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have laughed it off. But when you come face to face with something like that, it changes you. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. So that's my story. Take it for what it's worth. Maybe I'm just some nut who had a vivid hallucination. Or maybe, just maybe, there really is something out there in those mountains that science can't explain. All I know is I'll never forget that day as long as I live. And a part of me will always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if it's out there, watching and waiting. Story 13. I still remember that autumn evening in 1989 like it was yesterday. The memory of what I saw on that lonely road in Walworth County, Wisconsin haunts me to this day. I was 24 years old at the time, driving home after a late shift at the diner where I worked. The sun had long since set, and a chill hung in the air as I made my way down the winding country roads. The radio was playing softly as I drove, but I barely registered the music. My mind was occupied with mundane thoughts about grocery lists and upcoming bills. That ordinary train of thought was abruptly derailed when my headlights illuminated something standing at the edge of the road ahead. At first glance, I thought it was a large dog, or maybe even a bear. But as I drew closer, I realized with growing horror that this was no normal animal. The creature stood on two legs, its massive frame easily 7 or 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, shaggy fur, a mottled grayish-brown color that seemed to shimmer slightly in the glow of my headlights. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core. The snout was long and wolf-like, with a shock of white fur around the muzzle that stood out starkly against the darker coloring. Huge canine teeth glinted as its mouth hung slightly open. The ears were large and pointed, swiveling slightly as it regarded me. And those eyes, God, those eyes. They were a vivid golden-yellow color that seemed to glow with an inner light. There was an unmistakable intelligence in that gaze. This was no mere animal. As I slowed my car, too stunned to even think about fleeing, the creature turned its massive head to stare directly at me. Time seemed to stand still as we locked eyes. I felt paralyzed, unable to look away from that penetrating stare. There was no fear in its expression, only a calm, almost curious regard. I got the unsettling sense that it was analyzing me just as I was analyzing it. The moment was broken when the creature took a step towards my car. That was enough to finally jolt me out of my stupor. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the tires squealing as I accelerated away as fast as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I sped down that dark road, constantly glancing in my rearview mirror, terrified that I would see the creature loping after me. But there was nothing behind me but empty road. After a few miles, I finally allowed myself to slow down a bit, though my hands were still shaking on the steering wheel. The rest of the drive home passed in a blur. I stumbled into my apartment, locked the door behind me, and sank down onto the floor, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I had just witnessed. I knew what I had seen was impossible, and yet I couldn't deny the reality of it. The image of those glowing yellow eyes and massive fangs was seared into my memory. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound outside my window. The next morning, I seriously debated whether or not to report what I had seen to the police, but I knew how crazy it would sound. Who would believe me? They'd probably assume I was drunk or on drugs. So I kept quiet, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. For weeks afterwards, I was on edge every time I had to drive at night. I avoided that stretch of road entirely, taking a longer route home, even though it added an extra 20 minutes to my commute. I scoured local newspapers, half expecting to see reports of animal attacks or other sightings, but there was nothing. As time passed, I started to question my own memory of that night. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Maybe it was just a large wolf or bear, and my frightened mind had conjured up those humanoid features. But even now, decades later, I can still picture every detail of that creature with perfect clarity. The intelligence in those eyes, the way it stood upright on two legs, the sheer wrongness of its existence, it was all too vivid to be a mere trick of the mind. I've never seen anything like it again, thank God. But I've never forgotten that encounter either. To this day, I'm wary of driving on isolated roads after dark. The rational part of my brain tells me that what I saw was impossible. But a deeper, more primal part of me knows the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows just beyond the reach of our headlights. And sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them. I've never shared this story publicly before. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw that night. And I know that somewhere out there, in the forests and hills of Wisconsin, that creature is still out there, watching, waiting. I just pray I never cross paths with it again. The encounter has left me with so many unanswered questions. What exactly was that creature? Was it some kind of undiscovered species, or something more supernatural? Why did it just stand there and watch me instead of attacking? And why haven't there been more sightings or reports of similar creatures in the area? I've done some research over the years, looking into folklore and cryptozoology. The closest match I've found is the legend of the Dogman, a werewolf-like creature said to inhabit the forests of the Midwest. But even those stories don't quite match what I saw. The size, the intelligence in its eyes, the lack of aggression. It was unlike anything I've read about. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the visceral fear I felt in that moment, the way my entire body went cold when our eyes met. That kind of primal terror isn't something you can fake or imagine. It was real. Too real. I still live in Wisconsin, though I moved to a more populated area after that incident. I tell myself it's just because I wanted to be closer to better job opportunities, but deep down, I know the truth. I don't feel safe in those rural areas anymore, especially at night. Every time I drive past a densely wooded area, I can't help but scan the tree line, half expecting to see that massive silhouette watching me from the shadows. The experience changed me in ways that are hard to explain to others. I've become more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I don't take midnight strolls anymore, and camping is completely out of the question. Some might call it paranoia, but I prefer to think of it as being prepared, because I know what's out there, lurking just beyond the veil of what we consider normal. I've thought about reaching out to researchers or paranormal investigators over the years, but what would I tell them? I have no proof, no physical evidence, just the memory of an encounter that lasted less than a minute, decades ago. And yet, that brief moment has shaped the course of my entire life. Sometimes I catch myself staring out the window at night, wondering if it's out there somewhere. Does it remember me too? Does it ever think about that chance encounter on a lonely road? These are the thoughts that keep me up at night, even all these years later. I don't know if I'll ever have answers to my questions. Maybe it's better that way. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some creatures are not meant to be understood by human minds. All I know is that my worldview was irrevocably changed that night. The boundary between what's possible and impossible, between the natural and supernatural, became blurred in a way I can never undo. So I go on with my life, trying to find a balance between staying vigilant and not letting the fear consume me. But I'll never forget what I saw that night. And I'll always wonder what else might be out there, just beyond the reach of our understanding, waiting to be discovered, or to discover us. Story 14. I'll never forget that day in Spokane. We'd just moved there from Seattle, hoping the change of scenery would breathe some life back into our marriage. Things had been tense between Sarah and me for months, and we thought a fresh start might do us all some good, especially for our son, Nolan. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and I'd taken Nolan out to practice riding his bike without training wheels. We were at this little park near our new house, all golden leaves and the smell of wood smoke in the air. Nolan was nervous but excited, gripping the handlebars tight as I steadied the back of his seat. "You've got this, buddy," I encouraged him. "Just keep pedaling and look straight ahead." I jogged alongside him for a bit, then let go. He wobbled at first, but found his balance, a huge grin spreading across his face as he realized he was doing it on his own. I felt a swell of pride watching him zip down the path. That's when it happened. Nolan got a little overzealous, pedaling too fast around a curve. The bike tipped, and he went sprawling onto the gravel. I ran to him immediately, my heart in my throat. "Nolan, are you okay?" I called out as I approached. He was sitting up, sniffling but trying not to cry. Just some scraped knees and palms, thankfully. I knelt down to check him over, fishing in my pocket for some Band-Aids I'd brought just in case. As I was tending to his scrapes, I had this prickly feeling on the back of my neck. You know that sensation when you just know someone's watching you. It was like that, but 100 times more intense. I looked up, scanning the tree line at the edge of the park. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, was something. At first glance, I thought it was a bear. But bears don't stand upright like that. This thing was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in light brown fur, but the face... God, the face. It was disturbingly human-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to bore right into me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Every instinct screamed at me to grab Nolan and run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The creature and I locked eyes for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then it moved. Not towards us, thank God, but deeper into the woods. Its gait was fluid, almost graceful despite its bulk. In a few long strides, it had vanished into the trees. I snapped out of my daze, scooping up Nolan and practically sprinting back to our car. He was confused and started to protest, but must have sensed my urgency because he didn't put up much of a fight. "Dad, what's wrong?" he asked, as I buckled him into his seat with shaking hands. "Nothing, buddy," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just remembered we need to get home to help Mom with dinner." The drive home was a blur. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It couldn't have been real, right? Maybe it was just a very large man in a costume. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes. This was something else entirely. When we got home, I must have looked as shaken as I felt, because Sarah immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes darting between me and Nolan. I sent Nolan to his room to clean up and change, then pulled Sarah aside. In hushed tones, I told her what I'd seen. To her credit, she didn't immediately dismiss me or think I was crazy. She listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. "Are you sure it wasn't just a bear?" she asked gently. I shook my head vehemently. "Sarah, I know what I saw. This was no bear. It was, I don't even know how to describe it, like a giant, upright gorilla, but with a face almost like a person's." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Okay, I believe you saw something that scared you, but let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just someone playing a prank." I wanted to believe her, to find some rational explanation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives had just changed irrevocably. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside had me on edge. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, second-guessing what I'd seen. But every time, I came back to the same conclusion. This was real, and it was unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety. I was jumpy, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't want Nolan playing outside alone anymore, which he didn't understand. Sarah was supportive, but I could tell she was worried about my state of mind. Then, about a week after the incident in the park, it happened again. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner. The sun had just set, and through the window I could see the woods behind our house, dark and foreboding. As I was scrubbing a pan, movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of our yard, was the creature. It was partially obscured by shadows, but I could make out its massive silhouette. It was just standing there, watching the house. I dropped the pan with a clatter, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Sarah came running at the noise. "What's wrong?" she asked, alarmed. I pointed wordlessly at the window. Sarah followed my gaze, and I heard her sharp intake of breath. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Is that—" "Yes," I managed to choke out. "That's what I saw in the park." We stood there, frozen, watching this impossible being. It didn't move, didn't make any aggressive gestures. It just observed. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two, it turned and melted back into the forest. Sarah's hand found mine, gripping it tightly. "I'm sorry I doubted you," she said softly. I don't even know what that was. From that night on, our lives became a waking nightmare. We were constantly on edge, jumping at every sound. We kept Nolan inside as much as possible, which he hated. We stopped going on our evening walks. Our home, which was supposed to be our fresh start, now felt like a prison. The creature, I started thinking of it as the Bigfoot, for lack of a better term, seemed to be watching us. We'd catch glimpses of it in the woods, always at a distance, always just observing. Sometimes at night, we'd hear strange noises outside, heavy footsteps, branches snapping under immense weight. One night, about 3 weeks after the first sighting, things escalated. I was up late, unable to sleep as usual. As I sat in the living room, staring blankly at some late-night infomercial, I heard a tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. But it came again, more insistent this time. It was coming from Nolan's bedroom window. My blood ran cold. I crept down the hallway, my heart thundering in my ears. As I approached Nolan's room, I could hear his soft, steady breathing. He was still asleep, thank God. The tapping came again. 3 distinct knocks. With trembling hands, I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out. There, illuminated by the moonlight, was the Bigfoot. Its face was inches from the glass, those eerily human eyes staring right at me. I stifled a scream, stumbling backward and tripping over a toy on the floor. The noise woke Nolan. "Dad," he mumbled sleepily. "What's going on?" I scrambled to my feet, scooping him up and rushing out of the room. Sarah met us in the hallway, awakened by the commotion. "It's here," I gasped, "right outside Nolan's window." We huddled together in our bedroom, doors locked, waiting for dawn. The tapping didn't come again, but none of us slept a wink. The next day we found enormous footprints in the mud outside Nolan's window. Sarah took pictures, her hands shaking as she held up a ruler for scale. The prints were easily 18 inches long. That was the final straw. We couldn't live like this anymore. The constant fear, the sleepless nights, the strain on our relationships, it was too much. We decided to move, to get as far away from Spokane as possible. We told Nolan we were going on an adventure, packed up only what we could fit in our car, and left that very day. We drove for hours, putting as much distance between us and that house as we could. We ended up staying with Sarah's parents in California for a while, trying to make sense of what had happened to us. We never fully understood it. Was it really Bigfoot? Some unknown species? An elaborate hoax? We'll probably never know for sure. What I do know is that our time in Spokane changed us forever. Sarah and I grew closer through the ordeal, our petty arguments seeming insignificant in the face of what we'd experienced together. We became more appreciative of the simple things, a good night's sleep, the feeling of safety in our own home. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself listening for that telltale tapping at the window. And sometimes, when I look out into the woods, I swear I can see a pair of all-too-human eyes staring back at me from the shadows. Story 15. On July 20th, 1991, I decided to go for what I thought would be a short hike in the northern Highland American Legion State Forest. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm, but not too hot. I'd been coming to this area since I was a kid, so I felt confident heading out on my own, even though I didn't know the trails super well. I set out around 10 a.m., figuring I'd be back by lunchtime. I remember feeling so peaceful as I walked through the towering pines, listening to the birds chirping and breathing in that fresh forest air. But after about an hour, I started to get an uneasy feeling. The trees all looked the same, and I realized I had no idea which direction I'd come from. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. My heart started racing as I realized I was completely lost. I checked my watch. It was already past noon. How had I gotten so turned around? I took some deep breaths, trying to stay calm. I figured if I just kept walking, I'd eventually hit a road or trail. But as the hours ticked by, I only got more and more lost. The forest seemed to close in around me, getting denser and darker. My legs were exhausted from trudging through thick underbrush. By late afternoon, I found myself in a marshy area with water up to my waist. The mosquitoes were brutal, swarming around my face as I slogged through the muck. I was beyond scared at this point. I was in full-on panic mode. The sun was starting to set and I had no food, no water, no flashlight. I was soaked, shivering, and covered in bug bites. I kept imagining all the horrible ways I could die out here. Hypothermia, drowning in the swamp, getting eaten by a bear. As darkness fell, an eerie quiet settled over the forest. No more bird song, just the occasional hoot of an owl or splash of something in the water. I was exhausted but terrified to stop moving. Every snapping twig made me jump. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl coming from the darkness ahead of me. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before, too deep for a wolf, but not quite like a bear either. I froze in place, straining my eyes to see through the shadows. The growl came again, closer this time. I could hear something large moving through the brush. Panic overtook me, and I started running, splashing loudly through the swamp. I heard whatever it was crashing after me, but I didn't dare look back. I ran until my lungs were burning, finally collapsing against a tree trunk. I don't know how long I huddled there, shaking with fear and listening for any sound of pursuit. Eventually the woods grew quiet again. I was beyond exhausted, but too scared to sleep. I spent the rest of the night dozing fitfully, jolting awake at every little noise. As the sky began to lighten, I started moving again, desperate to find my way out. The swamp gradually gave way to firmer ground. Around mid-morning, I spotted something that made me stop in my tracks. There in the mud were a set of absolutely massive footprints. I'm a big guy. I wear a size 10 shoe. But these prints were easily twice the size of my feet. The shape was unmistakably human-like, but far too large to be a person. And there were no claw marks like you'd see with a bear print. I felt a chill run down my spine as I remembered the creature I'd heard in the night. I hurried on, not wanting to linger near those unnerving tracks. As I pushed through a particularly dense patch of vegetation, I heard that same deep growl from the night before. It was so close, it seemed to vibrate in my chest. I sprinted forward in blind terror, branches whipping my face. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst through the tree line and found myself on a gravel road. I've never been so relieved in my life. I followed the road for a couple miles until I reached a gas station, where I was able to call for help. When I finally made it back to the cabin, my family was frantic. I'd been gone for over 24 hours. I was dehydrated, covered in cuts and bug bites, and utterly shell-shocked. I tried to tell them about the footprints and the creature I'd heard, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. They assumed I was just delirious from being lost in the woods so long. I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times over the years. I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. Something was out there in those woods, something big and not quite human. I've read about Bigfoot sightings in Wisconsin, and I can't help but wonder if that's what I encountered. I still love the outdoors, but I've never gone hiking alone again, and to this day, the sound of twigs snapping in the dark is enough to make my heart race. Whatever was out there in the northern Highland forest, I hope I never cross paths with it again. Story 16. I'll never forget that day in September 1998. I was 15 years old, living in a small town in Vermont. My parents had sent me to pick apples from the local orchard, a chore I usually enjoyed. The crisp autumn air, the satisfying crunch of apples, the peaceful solitude. But that day changed everything. I remember walking through the rows of apple trees, my basket already half full. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the orchard. I was about to head home when I spotted a figure in the distance, partially obscured by branches. At first glance, I thought it was just another person picking apples. They seemed to be wearing a brown jumpsuit, probably one of the orchard workers. As I got closer, I realized something was off. The figure was unnaturally tall and bulky. Its movements were strange, jerky yet fluid at the same time. I froze, my heart starting to race. The creature, I couldn't call it a person anymore, was calmly plucking apples from the trees and eating them whole, core and all. I must have made a sound, because suddenly its head snapped in my direction. I'll never forget those eyes, dark and glittering with an intelligence that seemed both human and utterly alien. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Then it let out a sound I can only describe as a cross between a roar and a scream. In an instant, it dropped the apples and lunged towards me with incredible speed. I didn't even think, I just ran. I sprinted through the orchard, my basket of apples long forgotten. I could hear it crashing through the trees behind me, branches snapping. I risked a glance back and my blood ran cold. This thing wasn't just running, it was leaping from tree to tree with impossible agility. Its long arms swung it forward, covering ground faster than any human could. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning. The edge of the orchard seemed impossibly far away. I could hear its ragged breathing getting closer. In desperation, I veered off the path and into a denser part of the orchard, hoping to lose it among the trees. For a moment, I thought I had succeeded. The sounds of pursuit faded slightly, But then I heard a horrific howl of frustration, followed by the creaking of wood. I looked up just in time to see the creature launch itself from a tree branch directly above me. I screamed and dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as it barely missed me. Without missing a beat, I scrambled to my feet and kept running. My legs were trembling with exhaustion, but pure adrenaline kept me going. Finally, mercifully, I broke through the edge of the orchard. I sprinted across the open field towards the road, praying that a car would pass by. The sun had nearly set, leaving the world in an eerie twilight. I reached the road and allowed myself to look back. The creature had stopped at the edge of the orchard. It stood there, half hidden in shadow, watching me. Even from this distance, I could feel the weight of its gaze. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted back into the darkness of the trees. I collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for breath. My whole body was shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, if the fading light and my overactive imagination had conjured up a monster from an ordinary person. But I knew deep down that what I had seen was real. The primal fear I had felt, the superhuman speed and agility of the creature. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Eventually, I managed to pick myself up and stumble home. My parents were angry at first, demanding to know where I had been and why I was so late. But when they saw the state I was in, clothes torn, covered in dirt and scratches, eyes wild with fear, their anger turned to concern. I broke down crying, the full weight of my terror finally hitting me. Through sobs, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words seemed inadequate. How could I describe the otherworldly nature of what I had seen? The impossible speed and strength, the intelligence in those eyes that was so human yet so alien. My parents exchanged worried glances. I could tell they didn't fully believe me, but they could see how genuinely traumatized I was. They gently suggested that maybe I had seen a bear or a large man, and my fear had distorted my perception. I wanted to argue, to make them understand, but I was too exhausted. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature lunging for me. I kept imagining I could hear scratching at my window, convinced it had followed me home. The rational part of my brain knew I was safe in my room, but the fear was overwhelming. The next day, my dad drove me back to the orchard. He wanted to investigate, to put my mind at ease, but there was no sign of the creature, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate the chaos of the chase. The orchard looked peaceful in the morning light, as if nothing had ever happened. My dad tried to reassure me, suggesting again that I must have misinterpreted what I saw. But I knew the truth. The lack of evidence only made it worse. How could I prove to anyone what I had experienced? In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I was outside. I had nightmares almost every night, reliving the terror of the chase. My parents suggested I see a therapist, worried about my sudden anxiety and reluctance to leave the house. I overheard them talking one night, debating whether to contact the police or some kind of wildlife expert. But what would they say? That their teenage daughter claimed to have been chased by some kind of apple-eating monster. It sounded ridiculous even to me, and I had lived it. I spent hours researching online, looking for any similar encounters. I found stories of Bigfoot sightings, but none quite matched what I had seen. This creature had been more agile, more intelligent-seeming than the lumbering beast of legend. And why would it be in a small town in Vermont? As time passed, the intensity of the memory faded slightly, but it never went away completely. I learned to function again, to go about my daily life, but I never went back to that orchard. The sight of apple trees made my heart race for years afterward. Even now, over 20 years later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman roar ringing in my ears. I've never been able to fully explain or understand what happened that day. Was it some unknown species? An escaped experiment? Something beyond our current understanding of reality? I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't lived through it. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. That day in the orchard changed my perception of the world forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things out there beyond our comprehension, things that defy explanation. Sometimes, on crisp autumn days when the air smells of apples, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that tall brown figure emerge from the shadows. The fear never fully goes away, but neither does the curiosity, the burning need to understand what really happened on that September day so long ago. I've never shared this story publicly before. For years, I was too afraid of the ridicule, of being labeled as crazy or attention-seeking, but I feel like I need to get it out there to see if anyone else has experienced anything similar. Maybe someone out there has answers, or at least can validate that I'm not alone in this. So if you're reading this and it resonates with you, if you've had an encounter you can't explain, know that you're not alone. There are things in this world that defy our understanding, things that lurk just beyond the edge of what we consider normal. And sometimes those things find us when we least expect it, in the most ordinary of places, like a quiet apple orchard on a September afternoon. Story 17. I'll never forget that day, July 15th, 1970. It was a hot, muggy afternoon in Washington County, Maryland. I was 16 years old at the time, and I had decided to take my pony Buttercup and my dog Max out for a ride to escape the stifling heat inside our farmhouse. As we set out, the air was thick and heavy, almost oppressive. Cicadas buzzed loudly in the trees, creating a constant droning backdrop. Sweat trickled down my back as we made our way along the old dirt road that ran behind our property. Max trotted happily alongside us, tongue lolling as he panted in the heat. Buttercup plodded along steadily, seemingly unfazed by the weather. I remember feeling grateful for the slight breeze that stirred the leaves overhead, providing momentary relief from the sun beating down. We followed our usual route, winding through the dense forest that bordered our land. The trees provided welcome shade, and I found myself relaxing as we traveled deeper into the woods. The familiar scents of pine and rich earth filled my nose. After about 20 minutes, we came to a small clearing near the top of a hill. An old wooden fence ran along one side, remnants of a long abandoned property line. I often stopped here to let Buttercup graze for a bit while enjoying the view of the valley below. As I dismounted and looped Buttercup's reins over a fence post, something caught my eye on the other side of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe a bear, but as I squinted to get a better look, my blood ran cold. Standing just inside the tree line was the largest creature I had ever seen. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but massive, at least 8 feet tall and incredibly broad. Dark, shaggy fur covered its entire body. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear, an escaped gorilla. But this thing was walking upright on 2 legs, its arms swinging at its sides as it moved. I froze, my heart pounding. Buttercup and Max seemed completely oblivious, which only added to my confusion and fear. Shouldn't they be panicking at the sight or smell of such a massive predator? The creature took another step forward, and I could see its face more clearly now. It had a sloped forehead and a heavy brow, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with intelligence. Its mouth was set in a grimace, revealing pointed teeth. A low, rumbling growl emanated from its chest. The sound sent shivers down my spine and snapped me out of my paralysis. I scrambled to untie Buttercup's reins with trembling hands. Just as I was about to mount up and flee, the creature's eyes locked with mine. In that moment, I felt a jolt of recognition. Not that I knew this thing, but that it knew me. There was an unsettling awareness in its gaze. It took another lumbering step in our direction. Panic exploded in my chest. I swung up onto Buttercup's back and dug my heels into her sides, urging her into a gallop. Max barked and raced alongside us as we tore back down the trail. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see. My imagination conjured images of the creature pursuing us, those long arms reaching out to snatch me off Buttercup's back. We flew down the hill at breakneck speed. Low-hanging branches whipped at my face and arms. My lungs burned as I gulped in air. Buttercup's hooves thundered against the packed earth of the trail. It wasn't until we burst out of the tree line near our house that I finally slowed down. I practically fell off Buttercup, my legs weak and shaky. As I stood there, gasping for breath, I forced myself to turn and scan the forest edge. There was no sign of the creature. The woods were quiet, except for the usual chorus of birds and insects. Max trotted over, tail wagging, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. I led Buttercup to the barn on wobbly legs, my mind reeling. What had I just seen? Was it even real? How could something that big exist without anyone knowing about it? As I removed Buttercup's tack and brushed her down, I tried to make sense of the encounter. The creature's appearance, its intelligence, the way it moved, it all pointed to one impossible conclusion. But I couldn't bring myself to even think the word. I decided not to tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy or just making it up for attention. So I kept it to myself, but I never forgot. For weeks afterward, I was jumpy and on edge. Every snapping twig or rustling bush in the woods made me flinch. I avoided riding out to that clearing, sticking to the fields closer to the house. Slowly, life returned to normal. But I never stopped thinking about what I'd seen that day. I scoured books and newspapers for any similar sightings in the area, but found nothing concrete. Years passed. I grew up, went to college, got married. But the memory of that creature remained vivid in my mind. I often wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, if the heat and my teenage imagination had conjured up some kind of waking nightmare. Then, in the summer of 1978, something happened that chilled me to my core. I was visiting my parents' house with my husband and new baby. We were all sitting around the kitchen table after dinner when my mother casually mentioned seeing a big hairy thing in the woods behind the house a few days prior. My fork clattered to my plate. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shrugged. "Oh, I was washing dishes and happened to glance out the window. There was this enormous dark shape moving through the trees. At first I thought it was a bear, but it was walking on two legs. Strangest thing I've ever seen." I felt the blood drain from my face. My husband gave me a concerned look, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was that day 8 years ago, and the creature I'd seen in the clearing. "Did you get a good look at it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not really," my mother replied. "It was only there for a moment before it disappeared into the woods." "Why do you ask? You look like you've seen a ghost." I mumbled something about being surprised, then excused myself from the table. I spent the rest of the evening in a daze, my mind racing. That night, as we lay in bed in my old room, I finally told my husband everything. He listened without interrupting, his arm around me as I recounted that terrifying encounter from my youth. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Do you think it could have been a bear? Maybe standing up on its hind legs?" I shook my head vehemently. "No way. This thing was huge, way bigger than any bear. And the way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, it wasn't like any animal I've ever seen." He didn't push the issue, but I could tell he was skeptical. I couldn't blame him. I knew how crazy it all sounded. But I also knew what I had seen. The next morning, I hiked out to that old clearing for the first time in years. Everything looked the same. The gnarled old fence, the view of the valley. But something felt different. As I stood there, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had the distinct feeling of being watched. A twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, heart racing. For a split second, I thought I saw a dark shape move between the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. I hurried back to the house, my mind whirling. What was going on in these woods? Was the creature still out there after all these years? And if so, why hadn't anyone else reported seeing it? Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, jumping at every unexpected sound. My husband noticed my unease and suggested we cut our visit short. I agreed, both relieved and oddly reluctant to leave. As we drove away from my childhood home, I kept my eyes fixed on the woods until they disappeared from view. Part of me wanted to stay, to investigate further, and maybe finally get some answers. But another part was terrified of what I might find. In the years since, I've done a lot of research into similar sightings and encounters. I've read about Bigfoot and other cryptids, pored over grainy photos and shaky video footage, but nothing has ever quite matched what I saw that day. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever know the truth about what's out there in those Maryland woods. Was it some unknown species, an escaped exotic animal, or something else entirely? All I know for certain is that on July 15th, 1970, I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, and no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the mixture of awe and terror I felt in that moment, or the unsettling sense that whatever I saw recognized me too. To this day, I find myself drawn back to those woods whenever I visit my hometown. I've never seen the creature again, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching and waiting. And part of me hopes that someday, somehow, I'll get the chance to unravel this mystery once and for all. Story 18. It was a brutally cold night in the mountains, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you question why the hell you signed up for this in the first place. I was on fire watch with another corporal, Tom. Good guy, solid Marine. We'd been shooting the shit for a while, trying to keep ourselves awake and distracted from the biting cold. Around 0200, things got weird. I mean, really fucking weird. I was scanning the tree line like we were supposed to when I saw something move. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. You know how it is when you're tired and your mind starts messing with you. But then I saw it again. A shadow, bigger than anything I'd ever seen before, shifting between the trees. "Tom," I whispered, my breath visible in the frigid air. "You see that?" He squinted into the darkness. "See what?" Before I could answer, it stepped out into the clearing. Holy shit! I'll never forget it as long as I live. This thing had to be at least 10 feet tall. It was massive, covered in dark matted fur, but it wasn't a bear. No way in hell was that a bear. It stood on 2 legs, its arms hanging by its sides. They were long, too long, almost touching the ground. Its shoulders were broad, hunched forward slightly, and its face, Jesus. It had a face that looked almost human, but not quite. The eyes caught the moonlight, reflecting back at us like 2 glowing embers. I felt my heart skip a beat. My training kicked in, and I reached for my rifle, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip it. Tom was frozen beside me, his face pale as a sheet. The creature took another step forward, and that's when it let out this roar. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a mountain lion. It was deep, guttural, and it echoed through the mountains. I swear I felt it in my chest. That's when Tom lost it. He just turned and ran, leaving me there alone with this thing. I wanted to run too, but I couldn't move. It was like my feet were cemented to the ground. The creature and I just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I thought for sure I was going to die right there. Then, slowly, I started backing away, one step at a time, never taking my eyes off it. The whole time it just watched me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, its eyes locked on mine. When I finally made it back to the camp, everything was in chaos. Tom had woken everyone up, babbling about a monster in the woods. But by the time a search party was organized and we went back out there, the creature was gone. No tracks, no sign it had ever been there. The rest of the training exercise was a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing standing there, staring at me. The brass wrote it off as hysteria caused by the cold and lack of sleep. Tom and I were separated, sent to different units. I think they thought we were pulling some kind of prank. Years went by. I tried to forget about it, tried to convince myself it was just a hallucination or something, but I knew deep down what I'd seen was real. Then, about 5 years ago, I ran into Tom at a Marine Corps reunion. We hadn't spoken since that night. I pulled him aside, thinking maybe now, after all this time, we could talk about what happened. But Tom just looked at me with this haunted expression and said, "We both know what we saw that night. Let's leave it at that." And then he walked away. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that night in Bridgeport. Was it a Bigfoot, some kind of undiscovered species, or something else entirely? I don't know. But what I do know is that it was real, and it changed me forever. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods or even just walking my dog at night, I'll get this feeling like I'm being watched. And for a split second, I'll see those glowing eyes in the darkness, and my blood runs cold. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I have a hard time believing it myself. But I know what I saw that night. And I know that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of this country, there are things that defy explanation, things that we're not supposed to see. So if you're ever out in the woods, especially in those remote mountain areas, and you get that feeling like something's watching you, trust your instincts, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the tree line. I've never told this story to anyone besides Tom. Not my wife, not my kids, not even my closest buddies from the Corps. But I feel like I need to put it out there. Maybe someone else has seen something similar. Maybe I'm not crazy after all. All I know is that night in Bridgeport changed everything for me. It made me question everything I thought I knew about the world, and it left me with a fear that I can't shake, even after all these years. So there it is, my encounter with whatever the hell that thing was. I don't know if writing this down will help me make sense of it or just dredge up old nightmares, but at least now it's out there. And maybe, just maybe, someone will read this and realize they're not alone in what they've seen. As for me, I still serve in the Marines. I've been deployed to war zones, faced enemy fire, and seen things that would turn most people's stomachs. But nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever compared to the terror I felt that night in Bridgeport. So if you're ever in those mountains, keep your eyes open and your wits about you, because you never know what might be watching from the shadows. And if you hear a roar that doesn't sound like any animal you've ever heard before, run. Run like hell, and pray it doesn't follow you. Story 19. It was a warm evening, and I decided to take a walk in the woods behind my parents' house to clear my head. I'd been having some trouble with my girlfriend at the time and needed to blow off some steam. In hindsight, heading into the dark forest alone probably wasn't the smartest move. But hey, I was young and stupid. I grabbed my dad's old flashlight, one of those heavy metal ones that could double as a weapon if needed. Didn't think I'd actually need it for anything other than lighting my way, of course. As I stepped into the tree line, the chirping of crickets and rustling leaves seemed to swallow me up. At first, it was peaceful. The fresh air, the moonlight filtering through the branches. It was exactly what I needed to calm my nerves. I must have wandered for about 20 minutes, just letting my feet carry me deeper into the woods without any real destination in mind. That's when I started to get an uneasy feeling. You know that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched? Yeah, it was like that. I tried to shake it off, tell myself I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere off to my left. I whirled around, shining my flashlight in that direction. Nothing but trees and underbrush. I chuckled nervously, trying to convince myself it was just a raccoon or something. But then I heard another snap. Closer this time, and another. My heart started racing. Whatever it was big, way too big to be any normal forest critter. I started backing up slowly, keeping my light trained on where the sounds were coming from. That's when I saw it. Two enormous glowing eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. They were maybe 7 feet off the ground and the size of marbles. I froze in terror as this thing emerged from behind a thick oak tree. It was massive, covered in dark, matted fur, walking on 2 legs but hunched over slightly, arms hanging down past its knees. And those eyes, God, those eyes. They seemed to bore right through me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The creature took another lumbering step towards me, and I could smell its musky animal odor. Suddenly, it stopped. We just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then, without warning, it let out this bone-chilling roar. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal. It snapped me out of my paralysis, and I took off running. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. My lungs were burning, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I had no idea where I was or which direction I was running. All I knew was that I had to get away. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, I burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. My family's house was visible in the distance. I sprinted across the field, not daring to look back. I slammed into the back door, fumbling with the handle before practically falling inside. I slammed it shut and locked it, then collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. My parents came running, alarmed by the commotion. I tried to explain what happened between gulps of air, but I'm not sure how much sense I was making. My dad grabbed his shotgun and went outside to look around, but of course there was no sign of the creature. I begged him not to go into the woods. Looking back, I feel bad for scaring my folks like that. They probably thought I was on drugs or something. The next day, I convinced my dad to go back to the woods with me. I needed, some proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. We found the clearing where I had first encountered the creature, and there, pressed into the soft dirt, was an enormous footprint. It must have been at least 13 inches long and 6 inches wide. My dad was stunned. He'd lived in those woods his whole life and had never seen anything like it. We called the local police and they came out to investigate. They took plaster casts of the print and asked me a bunch of questions. I could tell they were skeptical, but that footprint was hard to explain away. News of my encounter spread quickly through our small town. Some people believed me. Others thought I was pulling some kind of prank. A few local hunters got all excited and wanted to organize a search party to track the thing down. I wanted no part of that. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound outside my window would set my heart racing. I kept replaying that moment in my mind, those glowing eyes, that overwhelming sense of terror. It was months before I could bring myself to go back into those woods, and even then, never alone. I'm 69 years old now, and I've never seen anything like that creature again. But I know what I saw that night. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a costume. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. Over the years, I've heard other stories from folks in the area who've had similar encounters. Some people think it's Bigfoot. Others have their own theories. I don't know what to call it. All I know is that it was real, and it was terrifying. I still live in Carroll County, not far from where it all happened. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I'll sit on my back porch and look out at those woods, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching and waiting. I hope I never find out. Story 20. Last year, I decided to take a break from my hectic life as a marketing executive in Seattle. The constant deadlines, client meetings, and office politics had left me burned out and yearning for something different. I'd always been fascinated by the tiny house movement, so I decided to build my own off-grid retreat in a secluded area near Goldendale, Washington. I found the perfect spot, a beautiful 5-acre parcel surrounded by dense forest, with stunning views of Mount Adams in the distance. It was remote enough to feel like a true escape, but still within driving distance of civilization if I needed supplies. I threw myself into the project, designing and building a cozy 200-square-foot tiny house with all the essentials. Solar panels for electricity, a composting toilet, rainwater collection system. I wanted to be as self-sufficient as possible. By early fall, my little sanctuary was complete. I took a leave of absence from work and moved in full-time, eager to decompress and reconnect with nature. Those first few weeks were blissful. I'd wake up to birdsong, spend my days hiking and exploring the surrounding wilderness, then unwind in the evenings with a good book by the wood stove. The stress of city life melted away, and I felt more at peace than I had in years. But then things started to change. It was subtle at first, just a growing sense of unease, like I was being watched. I'd be out gathering firewood and suddenly get the prickly feeling of eyes on me. I'd whirl around, heart pounding, but see nothing but trees and underbrush. I tried to brush it off as paranoia from being alone in the woods, but the feeling persisted. Then came the sounds. One night, I was jolted awake by a bone-chilling scream echoing through the forest. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. The sheer power and rage behind it made my blood run cold. I huddled in my bed, every muscle tense, straining my ears. The scream came again, closer this time. Then another, and another, seeming to circle my tiny house. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with possibilities. A mountain lion? Some kind of bird? But deep down, I knew it was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist. The screams became a nightly occurrence after that, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close. I started sleeping with a loaded shotgun by my bed, though I doubted it would do much good against whatever was out there. I considered packing up and leaving, but some stubborn part of me refused to be driven away from the home I'd worked so hard to build. Then it escalated. I woke one night to the sound of heavy, lumbering footsteps circling my house. The whole structure shook with each step. My heart was in my throat as I peered out the window, catching glimpses of a massive, hair-covered form in the moonlight. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. Suddenly, it stopped right outside my bedroom. There was a moment of utter silence. Then, bam! The creature slammed its head against the wall with incredible force. The entire tiny house rocked on its foundation. I bit back a scream, not daring to move or make a sound. It did it again and again, methodically testing the strength of my shelter. This went on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 15-20 minutes. Eventually the pounding stopped, and I heard it lumber away into the forest. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, shotgun clutched to my chest, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I examined the damage in the harsh light of day. There were deep dents in the siding where it had struck, and several of the screws had been shaken loose. But more disturbingly, I found long, coarse hairs stuck in some of the crevices. Proof that I wasn't going crazy, that this thing was real. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I came to my senses and left right then and there. But a mix of stubbornness, curiosity, and maybe a bit of shock kept me there. I reinforced the walls of the tiny house, installed motion-activated floodlights, and even set up some trail cameras in the surrounding woods. Part of me hoped to capture evidence of the creature, to prove to myself and others that it really existed. For a few nights things were quiet. No screams, no pounding. I started to think maybe I'd scared it off with all the new lights and activity. How wrong I was. It was just past midnight when all hell broke loose. I was awoken by a deafening crash, and the entire tiny house shifted violently. Disoriented and terrified, I scrambled for my shotgun as the assault continued. The walls groaned and buckled under repeated impacts. I could hear the creature's enraged roars between the thunderous blows. Then I saw it through the window. The creature had uprooted an entire pine tree and was using it as a battering ram against my house. The raw strength and intelligence it displayed chilled me to my core. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. There was purpose and strategy behind its actions. The tiny house didn't stand a chance. With a final splintering crash, the wall caved in, and I was face to face with my tormentor. In the chaos and darkness, I couldn't make out clear details. Just an overwhelming impression of size, strength, and fury. Matted hair, glinting eyes, massive hands ending in wickedly curved claws. I fired the shotgun on pure instinct, the blast deafening in the confined space. The creature roared in pain or rage and swung the tree again. I dove out of the way just in time, feeling the wind of its passage. Half crawling, half running, I managed to scramble out of the ruined tiny house. I ran blindly into the forest, driven by pure terror. Branches whipped at my face, and I stumbled over roots, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with every stride. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I broke through the tree line onto the gravel road leading to my property. By some miracle, a truck was driving by. Probably a local farmer headed to an early morning market. I frantically waved it down, practically throwing myself in front of it. The startled driver slammed on his brakes, and I dove into the passenger seat, screaming at him to go, go, go. He must have seen the naked fear in my eyes, because he floored it without question. As we sped away, I caught a final glimpse in the rearview mirror, a massive, hair-covered form emerging from the tree line, silhouetted in the pre-dawn light. Then we rounded a bend, and it was gone. I never went back to the tiny house. I couldn't bring myself to face what I'd experienced there. The farmer dropped me off in town, and I caught the first bus back to Seattle, still in my pajamas and probably looking like a lunatic. It's been months now, and I'm still struggling to process what happened. I've thrown myself back into work, trying to pretend everything is normal. But I can't shake the memory of those terrifying nights, the sound of that unearthly scream, the sight of my sanctuary being destroyed by something that shouldn't exist. I've done some research since then, and I know there have been other Bigfoot sightings in that area of Washington, but nothing like what I experienced. The level of intelligence and apparent territoriality it displayed goes beyond any other account I've read. Sometimes I wonder if I should go public with my story, try to warn others or get some kind of investigation going. But who would believe me? And honestly, I'm not sure I want to draw attention to myself or potentially provoke that creature again. So I stay quiet, carrying this secret, and trying to convince myself it was all just a bad dream. But deep down, I know the truth. and I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Story 21. I was just a kid back in '73, but that summer day in Carroll County is seared into my memory forever. It was June 3rd, a Sunday, and I remember it being hot and sticky even early in the morning. Ma and I were staying at my Aunt Diane's place out in the sticks, a rickety old farmhouse surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills. I was sitting at the kitchen table, half-heartedly picking at my breakfast while the adults chatted over coffee. That's when I saw it through the window, something huge moving in the tree line at the bottom of the ravine behind the house. At first I thought it was just a shadow or my eyes playing tricks, but then it stepped out into a clearing. My breath caught in my throat. Standing there, plain as day, was the biggest, strangest creature I'd ever laid eyes on. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with long arms that hung down past its knees. The thing was covered in shaggy grey-brown fur, like a bear but not quite. Its face was almost human-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glint with intelligence. I must have made some kind of noise, because Ma and Aunt Diane rushed over. "Howard, what on earth?" Ma started to say, but then she saw it too. All three of us stood there frozen, watching as this impossible beast lumbered across the clearing on 2 legs. "Sweet Jesus," Aunt Diane whispered. "What is that thing?" I couldn't take my eyes off it. The way it moved was so fluid and purposeful, not like any animal I'd ever seen. As it reached the other side of the clearing, it paused for a moment and seemed to look right at us. A chill ran down my spine. Then it melted back into the shadows of the woods. We all started talking at once, our voices shaky with disbelief and fear. What had we just seen? It couldn't be real, and yet we'd all witnessed it clear as day. Aunt Diane was already on the phone calling the police before I could even process what had happened. Within the hour, several officers had shown up to take our statements and search the area. I could tell they were skeptical at first, probably thought we were just some hysterical city folk seeing things. But as we described what we'd seen in vivid detail, I saw doubt creep into their eyes. They combed through that ravine for hours, but didn't find so much as a footprint. By mid-afternoon, most of them had packed up and left. Only one young deputy stuck around, looking troubled. "You folks mind if I stake out the area tonight?" he asked, just to be on the safe side. Ma and Aunt Diane readily agreed. I think we were all a little relieved to have someone else keeping watch. As evening fell, the deputy set up a little observation post on the back porch with a thermos of coffee and his binoculars. I couldn't sleep a wink that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face staring back at me. Around 2 a.m., I heard a commotion outside, the deputy shouting and the sound of his boots pounding down the porch steps. I rushed to the window just in time to see a massive dark shape loping across the moonlit yard, heading for the train tracks that ran along the edge of the property. The deputy was in hot pursuit, but he looked tiny compared to whatever he was chasing. They disappeared into the tree line by the tracks. A few minutes later, I heard the blast of a train horn in the distance. My stomach dropped as I imagined that poor deputy trying to dodge both a locomotive and that terrifying creature in the dark. The next thing I knew, it was morning. I must have dozed off eventually. Ma and Aunt Diane were huddled around the kitchen table with the sheriff and a couple other officers. Their faces were grim. Turns out the deputy had radioed in that he was chasing a large animal near the tracks right before his radio went silent. They'd found his abandoned patrol car, but no sign of him. The railroad company reported that one of their overnight freight trains had hit something big on the tracks, but by the time they'd stopped to check, there was nothing there. For weeks afterward, police and volunteers scoured those woods. They never found a trace of the deputy or whatever it was we saw that night. The official report chalked it up to a bear attack, but those of us who were there know the truth. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that creature's eyes boring into me from across the ravine. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear heavy footsteps circling my house. I've tried to tell myself it was just some kind of mass hallucination or elaborate hoax, but deep down, I know what I saw was real. There's something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist. And the scariest part is, I don't think we've seen the last of it. Every time I hear about another mysterious disappearance or strange sighting in the area, I wonder if it's still out there, watching and waiting. I just pray that whatever it is, it stays in the shadows where it belongs. Story 22. I was 22 years old at the time, working the night shift at a factory in Bowie. It was a mind-numbing job, but it paid the bills. That particular night, I was driving home around 2 a.m. after my shift ended. The roads were empty, as they usually were at that hour. I was taking my usual route along Route 301, eager to get home and crash into bed. As I approached the exit for Croom Road, something caught my eye up ahead. At first, I thought it was just a large animal that had wandered onto the highway, maybe a deer or even a bear. But as I got closer, I realized this was no ordinary animal. There, illuminated in my headlights, was the most terrifying creature I've ever laid eyes on. It was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, with a hulking humanoid shape. But this was no human. Its entire body was covered in thick, matted fur that looked almost slimy in the glow of my headlights. The fur was a sickly, yellowish-brown color, hanging in clumps as if the creature had just emerged from a swamp. I slammed on my brakes, my tires screeching on the asphalt. The thing whipped its head around to look at me, and I felt my blood run cold. Its face was like nothing I'd ever seen, vaguely ape-like, but with sunken eyes that glowed an eerie yellow-green in my headlights. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing rows of sharp teeth. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was frozen in terror, my hands clenched so tightly on the steering wheel that my knuckles were white. The creature seemed equally startled by my presence. It swayed back and forth, as if unsure what to do. Then, in a motion so fast I could hardly track it, the thing bounded across the road in 2 massive strides. It leapt clear over the guardrail on the opposite side of the highway, disappearing down the steep embankment beyond. I sat there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to get out and investigate, to prove to myself that I hadn't just hallucinated the whole thing. But a much larger part of me was screaming to get the hell out of there. I listened to that part. I gunned the engine and sped the rest of the way home, constantly checking my rearview mirror to make sure that thing wasn't following me. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I ran inside and triple-locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying the encounter over and over in my head, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It wasn't until a few days later, when I overheard some guys at work talking, that I learned I wasn't the only one who'd seen the creature. Apparently, there had been other sightings in the area over the past few weeks. People were calling it the Scaggsville monster, named after a nearby unincorporated community. The descriptions matched what I'd seen, a tall, fur-covered creature that seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanish just as quickly. I debated whether or not to report my own sighting. Part of me wanted to tell someone, anyone, about what I'd experienced. But another part of me was afraid of being labeled as crazy or attention-seeking. In the end, I kept quiet, but I started doing research on my own. I spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers and local history books. I found scattered reports going back decades of similar sightings in the area. Some described the creature as Bigfoot-like, others as more animal than human. But they all shared common elements: the massive size, the matted fur, the glowing eyes. I became obsessed with trying to figure out what this thing could be. I started exploring the woods around Croom Road on my days off, looking for any sign of the creature. I never saw it again, but I did find some strange things. unusually large footprints in muddy areas, tufts of coarse hair caught on tree branches, and once a half-eaten deer carcass that had been torn apart with incredible strength. My friends and family started to notice my obsession. They worried I was losing it, becoming some kind of conspiracy nut. Maybe they were right, but I couldn't let it go. The memory of that night haunted me. As the years went by, the sightings seemed to taper off. The Scaggsville monster faded into local legend, a story to scare kids around campfires. But I never forgot. I still avoid driving that stretch of Route 301 at night if I can help it. I'm an old man now, and I've never seen anything like that creature again. But I know what I saw that night. It was real as you or me. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can hear something moving in the woods behind my house, something big. I don't know what the Scaggsville monster was, or if it's still out there. But I do know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows, just beyond the reach of our understanding. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just catch a glimpse of them. To this day, I can't drive past that exit without my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The memory of those glowing eyes and that matted yellowish fur is seared into my brain. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was just a bear with some kind of skin condition, or a homeless person in a weird costume. But deep down, I know better. What I saw that night was something other. Something that shouldn't exist in our world, but somehow does. I've thought about going back to that spot many times over the years, maybe setting up some cameras or doing a real investigation. But fear always holds me back. What if I actually found something? What if it found me? There are some mysteries that are better left unsolved. The encounter changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I developed a deep respect and fear for the natural world and its unknown corners. Every time I hear about a cryptid sighting or an unexplained phenomenon, I think back to that night and wonder if someone else has had a similar experience. I've never told this story publicly before. For years, I was afraid of being ridiculed or dismissed. But now, in my old age, I find I care less about what others think. I know what I saw, and I feel a responsibility to share it. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar. Maybe this will help them feel less alone, less crazy. To anyone reading this who might have encountered something unexplainable, I believe you. Our world is vast and mysterious, and there are things out there beyond our comprehension. The Scaggsville monster might be gone now, or it might still be out there, lurking in the dark forests of Maryland. Either way, its memory will haunt me until the day I die. So if you're ever driving down Route 301 late at night and you see something strange in your headlights, don't stop. Don't get out of your car. Just keep driving and hope that whatever it is doesn't decide to follow you home. Because once you've seen something like that, you can never unsee it. It becomes a part of you, a shadow that follows you for the rest of your days. I don't know why I was the one to see it that night. Was it just random chance, or was there some greater purpose? I'll probably never know. But I do know that the world is stranger and more terrifying than most people realize. And sometimes, the monsters of our nightmares turn out to be all too real. Story 23. As I rounded a bend, my old Chevy suddenly started pulling to the right. The unmistakable flapping sound of a flat tire filled the car. "Damn it," I muttered, carefully steering onto the narrow shoulder. I sat there for a moment, heart sinking as I realized I was stranded in the middle of nowhere at nearly midnight. With a resigned sigh, I popped the trunk and grabbed the jack and spare. The cool night air raised goosebumps on my arms as I knelt by the flat tire. Crickets chirped in the tall grass beyond the shoulder. An owl hooted somewhere in the darkness. I tried to work quickly, eager to get back on the road. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the woods across the road. I froze, eyes straining to pierce the inky blackness between the trees. Probably just a coyote, I told myself, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I heard heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush, coming closer. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lug nuts. Whatever was out there, it sounded big, too big to be a coyote. Suddenly, two glowing yellow eyes appeared at the tree line. I gasped, dropping the tire iron with a clang. The eyes blinked, then moved forward into the dim glow of my headlights. What emerged from the shadows nearly stopped my heart. It was huge, at least 6'5", tall and massively built, but it wasn't human. The creature was covered in shaggy dark fur from head to toe. Its face was a terrifying mix of human and animal features, a broad, flattened nose, a mouth full of wicked curved fangs, and those glowing yellow eyes fixed intently on me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. The creature tilted its head, studying me. Then it took a deliberate step in my direction. That snapped me out of my trance. I scrambled to my feet and dove for the driver's side door, yanking it open and throwing myself inside. My trembling hands fumbled with the lock as the monster lumbered closer. Just as I got the door locked, a massive furry hand slammed against the window. I screamed, fumbling for the keys. The creature's hot breath fogged the glass as it peered in at me. Those yellow eyes bored into mine, filled with an alien intelligence. Somehow I got the key in the ignition and cranked the engine. The tires squealed as I floored it, fishtailing on the gravel shoulder before gaining traction. The flat tire thumped and wobbled, but I didn't care. I just had to get away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature standing in the road, watching me flee. Then it melted back into the darkness of the forest. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest gas station, hands shaking so badly I could barely put the car in park. The flat tire was shredded, the rim bent and mangled, but I didn't care. I was alive. To this day, I don't know what I encountered on that lonely road. Some kind of wild man, an escaped circus animal, or something else entirely, something science can't explain. I've run it over in my mind 1,000 times, trying to make sense of it. But the memory of those glowing eyes and gleaming fangs still haunts my dreams. I never drive those back roads at night anymore, and I always keep my doors locked, even in broad daylight, because I know there are things lurking in the shadows of this world that defy explanation, things that hunt in the dark. And I never want to come face to face with one of them ever again. The encounter left me deeply shaken for weeks afterward. I had trouble sleeping, plagued by vivid nightmares of glowing eyes and gnashing teeth. During the day, I felt constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in familiar places. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, but I knew that wasn't right. The creature had moved with an eerie grace, almost human-like. And those eyes. There was an intelligence there that no animal possesses. I scoured the local newspapers, hoping to find reports of other sightings, but there was nothing. I considered going to the police, but what would I say? That I was attacked by Bigfoot? They'd think I was crazy or on drugs, so I kept it to myself, letting the secret gnaw at me. I became obsessed with researching cryptids and unexplained phenomena. I dove deep into online forums and fringe websites, looking for any scrap of information that might explain what I'd encountered. The more I read, the more convinced I became that there are things in this world that science can't explain. Hidden creatures that lurk just beyond the edges of our perception. It was both terrifying and oddly comforting to know I wasn't alone in my experience. Weeks turned to months, and slowly the raw fear began to fade, but I never forgot. I became hyper-vigilant, always scanning my surroundings for any hint of danger. I took up hunting, partly for the sense of security that came with carrying a weapon. but also because I harbored a secret hope of encountering the creature again, this time on my terms. Years passed. I got married, had kids, built a life. But I never told anyone about that night. How could I explain the profound impact it had on me, the way it had shaken my entire worldview to the core? Then one crisp autumn evening, I was out in the backyard splitting firewood. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vivid oranges and purples. As I paused to wipe sweat from my brow, movement at the edge of the woods caught my eye. My blood ran cold as I saw a dark, hulking shape slip between the trees. Just for an instant, I glimpsed those unmistakable yellow eyes glowing in the gathering dusk. Then it was gone. I stood rooted to the spot, axe clutched in white-knuckled hands. Was it back? Had it been watching me all these years, waiting for the right moment? Or was my mind finally cracking under the weight of that long-ago trauma? I'll never know for sure. But sometimes on quiet nights, I think I hear heavy footsteps in the woods beyond our property. And I wonder if someday, somehow, I'll come face to face with that nightmare creature once again. Until then, I keep my doors locked. I stay vigilant, and I never, ever go into the woods alone after dark. Because I know firsthand that there are things out there in the shadows, things that defy explanation, things that hunt, and I never want to be caught unprepared again. Story 24. We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon and set up our gear, a couple of tents and my trusty hammock. I always preferred sleeping in a hammock when camping. Something about being suspended between the trees just felt right to me. The first night passed uneventfully. We grilled some burgers, drank a few beers, and swapped stories around the campfire before turning in. Saturday was spent hiking the trails, taking in the spring scenery, and feeling like we were a million miles from civilization. As night fell on Saturday, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The usual forest sounds, chirping crickets, hooting owls, seemed muted somehow. An eerie quiet had settled over our little campsite. We tried to ignore it, chalking it up to our imaginations running wild in the dark woods. We stayed up late again, but there was an undercurrent of tension. Our jokes felt forced, our laughter a bit too loud. When we finally decided to call it a night around 1 a.m., I climbed into my hammock with an unsettling sense of foreboding. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, drifting in and out of a restless half-sleep. The stillness was oppressive. Then, just as the faintest hint of pre-dawn light was starting to filter through the trees, I heard it. At first, I thought I was dreaming, a low, guttural sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started as a deep, rumbling growl, almost like a lion's roar, but then morphed into something higher-pitched, reminiscent of an owl's screech, but far more grating and unnatural. My eyes flew open and I lay there frozen, barely daring to breathe. Surely I had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. A bone-chilling howl that seemed to reverberate through the entire forest. I wanted to call out to Brian and Tom to make sure they were hearing this too, but terror had paralyzed my vocal cords. I couldn't make a sound. That's when I heard the first crack of a branch snapping nearby. Something big was moving through the underbrush, and it was close. Too close. More branches broke in rapid succession. Whatever this thing was, it was heading straight for our campsite. The impacts were heavy, shaking the ground with each step. This was no deer or black bear. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no logical explanation for the otherworldly sounds echoing through the woods or the sheer size of whatever was approaching. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up from this nightmare. But the sounds only grew louder, more insistent. Leaves rustled, twigs snapped, and that horrifying howl pierced the night once more. It was right there. I could feel its presence just beyond the thin nylon of my hammock. My entire body was rigid with fear, sweat pouring off me despite the cool night air. I didn't dare move a muscle or even open my eyes. The creature, and I use that term because I have no other way to describe it, circled our campsite slowly. I could hear its labored breathing, smell a musky odor that turned my stomach. It paused near each of our sleeping areas in turn. When it reached my hammock, I thought my heart would explode from my chest. I felt hot breath on my face and heard deep, rumbling snuffles as it apparently sniffed at me. I was certain that at any moment massive jaws would clamp down and end my life. But after what felt like an eternity, it moved on. I heard it lumbering away, branches breaking under its weight as it retreated back into the depths of the forest. That unearthly howl echoed one last time, fainter now, in the distance. As the first rays of dawn began to break through the canopy, I finally found the courage to open my eyes and sit up. The forest was quiet again, but not with the oppressive stillness of the night before. Birds were beginning to chirp as they greeted the new day. I looked over at my friends' tents with trepidation. Had they experienced the same terror? Or had I somehow dreamed the whole thing? To my shock, Tom emerged from his tent, looking well-rested and chipper. "Morning," he called out. "You guys sleep okay? I was out like a light." Before I could respond, Brian unzipped his tent and stumbled out. His face was ashen, dark circles under his wide eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept a wink. Our gazes met, and I knew instantly that he had heard it too. What was that?" Brian whispered, his voice trembling. Tom looked back and forth between us, confused. What was what? Did something happen last night? I opened my mouth to try to explain, but where could I even begin? How could I possibly put into words the primal fear we had experienced? In the end, Brian and I said very little. We packed up camp in tense silence while Tom chatted away, oblivious to our distress. The drive back to campus was equally quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. In the weeks and months that followed, Brian and I tried to make sense of what had happened that night. We scoured newspapers and local reports for any similar incidents. We even reached out to some cryptozoology forums, though we were hesitant to share too many details for fear of ridicule. But we never found any satisfying answers. No one else reported strange sightings or sounds in that area. There were no unexplained livestock deaths or missing hikers. It was as if whatever had terrorized us that night had simply vanished into thin air. To this day, over 30 years later, I still get chills when I think about that camping trip. I've never been able to bring myself to sleep in a hammock again, and I avoid camping whenever possible. The thought of spending a night in the woods fills me with a nameless dread. Brian and I have stayed in touch over the years, bound by our shared experience. We don't talk about it often, but when we do, I can see the same haunted look in his eyes that I'm sure is mirrored in my own. I know how this story must sound to anyone who wasn't there. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I'd probably dismiss it as the overactive imagination of some scared kids in the woods. But I know what I heard and felt that night. And I know that somewhere out there, in the dark forests of this world, there are things that defy explanation, things that are better left undisturbed. So if you're ever camping in the Maryland woods and you hear an unnatural howl in the night, don't dismiss it. Don't try to investigate. Just pack up your gear and get out of there as fast as you can, because you never know when you might encounter something that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Story 25. I was just a teenager back in '93, but that September hunting trip in Hartford County still gives me chills to this day. My uncle had invited me along with some of his buddies for their annual pre-season target practice weekend. I was thrilled to tag along, eager to prove myself as one of the guys. We set up camp Friday evening in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. The air was crisp with the first hints of fall, and I remember feeling so alive as we sat around the campfire swapping stories. If only I'd known what was lurking in those woods. Saturday morning, we hiked out to a makeshift shooting range they'd set up. I was still learning, so I mostly watched as the men took turns showing off their marksmanship. The crack of rifles echoed through the trees. It was mid-afternoon when things took a turn. I was helping my uncle reload when suddenly the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. An eerie silence had fallen over the forest. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. That's when we saw it. About 100 yards away, a massive dark shape emerged from the tree line. At first I thought it was a bear, but as I watched it move, I realized this was something else entirely. It walked upright, swinging long arms as it lumbered along the edge of the clearing. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. My uncle didn't respond, just slowly raised his rifle and peered through the scope. The creature paused next to a good-sized oak tree. With shocking speed, it reached up and violently shook the trunk. The entire tree swayed as if caught in gale-force winds. Acorns rained down around it. I heard my uncle's breath catch. "Mother of God," he muttered. He beckoned the other men over, passing the rifle so they could each take a look. I was desperate to see for myself, but stayed rooted to the spot, heart pounding. "It's at least 8 feet tall," one of the guys said in a strained voice. "Covered in dark fur. Those arms. Jesus, look at the muscle definition." They passed the rifle to me with shaking hands. Peering through the scope, I finally got a clear view of the monster. Shaggy brown fur covered its entire body. The head was oddly shaped, pointed on top with a sloped forehead. But it was the eyes that haunted me, deep set and glinting with intelligence. This was no bear or other known animal. As I watched, it turned and looked directly at our position. A chill ran through me. It knew we were there. We all stood frozen, unsure what to do. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this couldn't be real. But the primal instincts kicking in told me we were in serious danger. Suddenly the creature let out a roar that shook me to my core. It was like nothing I'd ever heard, part growl, part scream. Without warning, it dropped to all fours and charged into the forest, surprisingly agile for its size. We all let out a collective breath. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Was that what I think it was? I finally managed to stammer out. My uncle's face was pale. "I don't know what the hell that was, but we need to pack up and get out of here. Now!" We scrambled to break down the targets and gather our gear. I kept scanning the tree line, terrified that thing would come bursting out at any moment. The sound of twigs snapping in the distance had us all on edge. As we hurried back towards our campsite, my uncle pulled me aside. "Listen, when we get back to town, we don't breathe a word of this to anyone, you understand? They'll think we're crazy." I nodded, still too shocked to fully process what was happening. We practically ran the last quarter mile to the clearing where we'd set up camp. Just as the tents came into view, all hell broke loose. There was a deafening crash behind us, like a tree being ripped from the ground. My uncle yelled for us to run. I sprinted for the campsite, heart in my throat. I dove into my tent, frantically gathering my belongings. Outside, I could hear the men shouting and more crashes in the woods. Stuffing the last of my clothes in my backpack, I emerged to chaos. The campsite looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Tents were flattened, gear strewn everywhere. My uncle's buddy Tom was struggling to his feet, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. "It came out of nowhere," he was saying. "Didn't even see it, just felt something slam into me." My uncle helped him up, wild-eyed. "Where is it? Did anyone see where it went?" We all shook our heads, searching the trees for any sign of movement. The silence was deafening. "Let's get the hell out of here," my uncle said. We didn't need to be told twice. We threw our gear haphazardly into the trucks and peeled out of there, tires spitting gravel. I kept looking back, half expecting to see that hulking shape burst from the tree line in pursuit. But there was nothing. The drive home was tense and quiet. We were all lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. I couldn't shake the image of those eyes staring right at me. True to our word, we never spoke publicly about what happened that day. Who would believe us anyway? But in the years since, I've done a lot of research. I've read accounts from others who've had similar encounters in those Maryland woods. They all describe the same thing, a massive, ape-like creature that walks on two legs. Some call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is what I saw that day was real. And somewhere out there, that creature is still roaming the forests. I haven't been camping since.